this time, please join me in a moment of silence. Please stand for the Pledge of Allegiance.
Pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
All right, good morning. I guess everybody's up on a bright Saturday morning. I kind of wanted to sleep out, the chill in the air, but I had to get up to come down here to talk about our favorite subject, the landfill. So we're here to talk about the landfill, and it's nothing like talking about trash on a Saturday morning, right?
That's right.
So anyway, with that said, we know we've talked about the landfill a while. It is one of the city's bigger financial issues that we got to figure out. So we've had some consultants at the state of Virginia came in to help us analyze it, to provide some data. We've been looking at data obviously for a couple of years, and we've been looking at data even more closely here recently to try to understand the landfill and look at it from every angle we possibly can. So when I made comments like, all options are on the table, really all options are on the table. We need to look at it, very creatively and from all the different angles we possibly can to see if we can't make it a balanced zero or a break-even neutral enterprise fund. At least we can close the gap as much as possible so we limit the taxpayer general fund subsidies that's been occurring over years. So there's a lot to talk about. So I think as we get into this, Randy, and the terminology is probably going to get people thinking differently. So let's make sure we're describing each section really closely, like, there's collection, there's commercial haulers, and so we're not getting confused, even the costs and so forth. So let's, because that's going to be embedded in like total numbers. So
Sure.
Make sure we separate those so we're talking in the old landfill versus the new. We know which one we're talking about and that kind of stuff. So with that said, anybody got any comments or other things you want to say before we get started? All right.
All right, well, we're going to open up this morning's session with Mr. Bob Dick from SCS Engineers. He's going to kind of give another quick overview of how SCS became involved and where we're at and where SCS is in regards to the analysis of our landfill.
Good morning. I'll ask that my presentation be brought up here. And as you recall, I was with you back in early January, and I'm just going to give an overview and a refresher on what SCS analysis was for the financial circumstances regarding the city's enterprise fund and their solid waste finances. We had a team that got involved here back in August. Myself, Ryan Duckett, and Vita Quinn, and I worked for SCS for the last 29 years doing solid waste engineering and solid waste financial things, focused a lot on landfills especially. And so we were brought in by the state to assist the city with evaluating what some options are potentially to get better financial structure and sustainability in the enterprise fund.
Is that on, Wallace?
Work once for me. Yeah, it's on. Okay. I've lost my ability to, there we go. So the Solid Waste Enterprise Fund that the city maintains has two cost centers. One is the collections division and the disposal division, and revenues come into that fund with solid waste fees, waste collection fees, and solid waste disposal tipping fees at the landfill. The expenses are what you would expect: O&M, capital, debt service, equipment, fuel, things like that needed to maintain the facility. And it's about $6 million a year in expenses. Just to give you a reminder as far as what the Solid Waste Disposal Division does, it's the Integrated Solid Waste Management Facility. I may refer to that sometimes as the landfill. There's actually multiple activities or enterprises out there. Revenues come from the tipping fees, mulch and compost sales, recycling sales. Obviously, the most significant revenue in terms of quantities are the tipping fees. So let's just talk about what was brought up or alluded to earlier briefly, was that there's the quarry landfill, the permit 588. It opened in 1988. It's got approximately 27 years of remaining site life, assuming that the waste acceptance rates would continue at about 175,000 tons per year, and that the compaction ratio and densities being achieved are similar to current conditions. The permit 498 is what's considered an inactive landfill. It has yet to be closed and capped. It operated up till 2002, and landfill mining is being performed to reclaim soil. And there's a closure requirement that imposes a liability of about $3.1 million to close with a deadline of 2020. The Solid Waste Collection Division does exactly what it sounds like. It's responsible for collecting waste from residential and certain select commercial businesses within the city. The revenues from that division come specifically from residential collection fees right now at $22 a month. And the services are an extremely high level of service. The city provides wonderful programs in that you can set a lot of things out, your household garbage, your bulk waste, yard waste, weekly service. The city provides a cart. The city provides a very high level of service to citizens for that. And there's also recyclable drop-off centers, household hazardous waste, and e-waste, electronic waste disposal opportunities. Just the financial background here, and I'll remind you what we've said back in January, that historically the collection rates, the waste collection fees applied to the citizens were very low and stayed low and did not have any inflationary or escalation rate adjustments for many years. There have been certain select rate increases recently, but I have a graph to show why that's just now getting the city back to where typical CPI-related inflationary rate adjustments would have gotten you anyways. And so a couple of the pressures on rates, there's low tipping fees negotiated with haulers. Right now, the gate rate of landfill at $30 a ton is paid by few customers, but the majority of the customers are bulk commercial haulers or surrounding adjacent localities that have negotiated tipping fees that are more in the $16 to $22. Another significant rate pressure is the financial assurance closure and post-closure liability for both the active and the inactive landfill. They constitute a cumulative total of about $19 million.
Okay, go back one slide there. Can
Sure.
you explain the 19 million a little bit more?
Landfills have to not only cap and close and apply a final cover to the waste footprint, but they also have to continue to monitor things like gas and groundwater and environmental control systems for approximately 30 years. And so the requirement is to demonstrate that you have the financial means to do that. The 19 million here is a breakdown of both the closure and the post-closure care for both those two landfill units that I mentioned, what I call the 588 and the 498.
Okay. One thing, the reason I stopped, I want to make sure everybody understood, that 19 million is both landfills, the old and the new, right? Which you just described.
Correct.
And then of the 19 million, and I'm going by memory here, so you can correct me if I'm wrong, that of the 19 million, about 6 of that is the old landfill, which we call permit 498,
Correct.
okay? And so that means the balance, which is about 13 million or whatever, is the current landfill. Okay.
Yes.
So now of the 6 million, you already showed on one slide, there was a 3 million due immediately to cap it, prepare it for monitoring. Is that what the 3 million is basically
Right,
for?
the 3 million's kind of an instantaneous capital project to cap the landfill.
So you take the 6, and 3 of that is immediately due in 2020 or wherever to pay that fee. And then the balance of that, 3 million, which totals the 6, then you pay over a 30-year time period.
Correct.
Okay. So on the 6 million, I'm sorry, on the 13 million for the current landfill, what is your estimate on how that would break down? Would it be about 6 million would be the initial fee to close it, then you would have 6 million of monitoring over 30 years? How would that break out?
Yeah, so if my numbers are correct, my recollection is the capping is 7.6 million.
Okay.
And the post-closure care, which, as you correctly stated, is expended over the entire post-closure care period, is 5.9 million.
Okay. All right.
Okay. Some quick information about the financial background of the enterprise fund. There's $35 million in general obligation debt. Mr. Eads will cover this in his presentation as well. It's been used to fund capital, and the city has historically made interest-only payments on that. It was alluded to earlier, too, that there's been some general fund transfers to keep the solid waste enterprise fund solvent. There was a $22 million write-off in 2016 of the debt to the general fund, and right now the enterprise fund has a net position of negative $20 million.
Okay, and what's the current payments annually on the 35 million? Is it
Roughly $2 million a year.
Yeah, it's
Right.
about 2.2 or so.
2.1 to 2? Okay, about 2.2 a year. So we're paying 2.2 million of payment every year now based on principal and interest on that 35 million of long-term debt. Yeah, that's about right. Okay.
Oh, this was a topic that we focused on back in early January to remind you, too, that when you look at the revenues versus the expenses on an annual basis of the fund, it would appear as if there's actually a little bit in the black in terms of the revenues being 6.9 and the expenses being 6.2. But notice that the bond proceeds really are influencing that revenue, and then also the general fund transfer. And so what you are left with when you evaluate what the actual revenues are in terms of operating revenues, it's 4.8 million. So each year the fund's experiencing about $1.4 million loss there. And that was largely due to the debt service that was just mentioned. I just want to point out some key issues here. The landfill, the vertical lining system is approximately about 2.5 million, and the frequency of those lining events, while they are dependent on waste acceptance rates and the densities being achieved in the facility, it works out to about every 3 years that the liners need some capital funding. And then I had already mentioned that the haulers have negotiated tip fees that are depressed and aren't covering the cost of the actual service.
Okay, stop. I want to stop you right there. So on the 2.5 million, we have, we've talked about 2 million over 2.5 years, 2.5 million over 3 years. We need to make sure we understand what that accrual cost will be on a good, solid average every year. So is this a more solid number, we think, the 2.5 million divided by 3, which that means that's about a, $800,000 a year thing?
Well, a lot of that number depends on exactly what our rate will end up ultimately being, because we can only afford so much liner if we want to pay cash, which is the only way that the city can afford to pay for a landfill liner now is through cash. You'll see in my presentation, we have several different options that go from purchasing $1.8 million worth of lining up to $2 million worth of lining, depending on what rate structure council chooses. 2.5 million would probably be, that's your optimal.
Okay, so my question is in the context of the intake of trash into the landfill.
And that's my answer.
It doesn't change, it's the same. You know,
It's going to change depending on whatever rate structure you all pick.
I'm saying, don't assume any rate structure. If we didn't change rate structure, what?
Then we can't afford a
With
liner,
the current, no, that's not the question. The current intake, based on the current rate structure,
right?
you got 175,000 tons going in, right? The current rate structure, so is that number of 2.5
You're talking about the
million-
length of time the liner would last.
Yeah, every
Okay.
3 years, we would have to replace the 2.5
You're
million based
looking-
on current.
Currently this liner's it'll last us right at 2 years. Is that right, Wallace? The current liner that we have now that was installed, spring of 17?
16.
Spring of 16?
Yeah, this number is actually
No,
historical.
it would have been installed spring of 17 because they borrowed that money in November of 16 for that liner.
Yeah.
So it would have been installed in spring of 17. So it's lasted about 2 years right now.
And this
Because-
number is historical average, as the configuration of the landfill is such that the vertical lining distance the height as the circumference of the actual pit changes. So it isn't a consistent thing every time. It changes,
So the landfill
fluctuates.
quarries like
Right.
this, it's a cone.
Right, so the cost here could be representative of the configuration, the amount of lining that was necessary in past years when the cone was a smaller circumference.
All right.
And then certainly we've talked about the need to make contributions to that 19 million of closure and post-closure liabilities.
What was that last one? I missed that, the average. Oh,
Yeah,
debt
that's what we
service,
were
yeah.
mentioning.
Yep, yep.
So what SCS did was took a lot of the data and the information that was available from the CAFRs, and then we did a revenue sufficiency modeling and looked at cash in versus cash out, and identified obviously that the fund was not sustainable. We modeled a baseline scenario. You recall that I presented the details on this, as well as my colleague Vita Quinn back in January, and looked at basically the message here is that without any action of some sort in terms of rate adjustments, the fund balance is exhausted in fiscal year 2020. And then we isolated the collections program and included the debt service here in order to demonstrate that the cash balance remains positive.
And I want to reiterate that was based upon we having a buyer for the landfill, which would mean the city would no longer have any of the operational costs of the landfill. We would only be responsible for the debt associated with the landfill, is this rate structure here.
Yes, so this was a scenario in which we just isolated the collections division and excluded the disposal division, but maintained the debt.
Can you go back to that previous slide and explain a little more when you say the fund will be exhausted in 2020, can you explain that in financial terms so we're all on the same page on that one?
Okay. Yeah, the balance of it with the $22 coming in, this assumed a couple things, that the tipping fees and customer accounts maintain the same, that the average residential bill had no changes to it, and that there was cash-funded capital for the liner, no accrual to post-closure care, and then it basically all monies in the fund would be removed in the current fiscal year.
Okay. CFO, can you explain it a little more from your perspective on when he says the fund will be exhausted? Because you can always transfer money over, but.
Right, typically, the solid waste disposal fund, as of right now, has a little bit of cash. It does normally end the fiscal year with a little bit of cash, although the financial statements show a negative net position. There is a little bit of cash. We have to have cash at June 30th because we have significant debt payments due July 1st. We anticipate, based on current projections, that are projections, estimates, that at June 30th, we will have about $2 million in cash, of which $711,000 is due out July 1st in the form of a payment, debt payment. Our financial statements, according to our financial statements, we ought to have about $8.6 million in cash to fund the closure, post-closure. What Bob is referring to is that the cash will be exhausted. He's talking about the cash on hand, that if something isn't done to correct this, the actual fund, even with general fund transfers, will run out of cash to pay its expenditures.
Okay, and that $700K payment in June, is that for liner, debt, or both?
That 711 this upcoming year is the July 1st debt payment. So when he says the fund balance will be exhausted, and it says up there the cash balance, it will actually run out of cash.
Can I ask a question?
Yeah.
So when you did this modeling, and kind of to piggyback on what you're saying, you just assumed the status quo, that we're going to continue the transfer from the general fund at the same amount that we have been?
That was kept, and we looked at it about, Mr. Eads, several different ways.
2,000 different ways.
And I think our original intent was to eliminate that, and we felt like we couldn't. So this information kept it constant.
So
at one
this
percent.
is still, I mean, it's going to run out of cash with already this transfer at the same amount that we have.
Yes,
It would
sir.
still run out of cash.
Yes, sir.
Okay.
Correct.
When you say the same amount, the transfer has changed a little bit from, say, 2014
Yeah.
to date. So
No.
it was as high as, I think, 800,000 or 900,000. It's been down to, what, 500,000 or 600,000. So are you saying about 500,000 or 600,000?
Yes.
I think the number is 607,000.
Yeah. So at that rate,
Yeah.
we're out of
At
cash.
the current
in
rate.
2020. Yeah, current rate. Okay, gotcha.
Yeah, just a reminder of this baseline scenario: no residential or commercial customer rate increases, cash funding, critical capital, so no additional debt. It includes continuation of the general fund transfer, imposes nominal contributions to closure and post-closure reserves, does not incorporate any major maintenance, does not incorporate the permit 498 capping.
And I want to add, too, that in addition to the roughly $600,000 in the general fund transfer that you see, part of the disposal revenue, $375,000, is also coming out of the general fund to cover a shortfall as well in regards to collecting city waste. So you're really looking at close to $1 million a year is coming from our general fund going into the solid waste fund.
That's just on the the loss side of it. We still, the city taxpayer is paying the $2 million on the debt. So really, it's a $3 million negative. Because we're still paying the debt at 2.1 or 2.2 million, plus we're falling short on the revenue side and subsidizing it 600,000, 607, and then you're talking about another 300,000, so that's a $3 million negative
That
annually.
landfill debt is paid out of landfill revenues. That 2.1 million, the moving, it's around 2 million, it is paid from solid waste disposal fund revenues, not general fund revenues.
Okay, well, that's good to know.
So what's not, yeah, and I thought, I was going to ask the question because he was starting to confuse me a little bit, but I thought, on the expense side, everything's in there operationally plus the debt service.
Correct.
So what we don't have in there is the liner cost that
Right.
occurs every year, and we don't have any accrued expenses for the capping or the monitoring
correct.
of the, so those costs are kind of over here that aren't on the enterprise funds sheet, which we have to cover.
They're on no one's sheet right
I know,
now.
but those are real costs.
Right.
That we're not dealing with. So the liner, you're just, when the liner needs, to be bought, that's just a special, expense transfer of the accounting funds from the general fund to pay that, and then you move on.
In the past, it's always been taken care of by debt. So there has never been any general fund transfer in order to cover the landfill liner. It's always been covered by debt. What we're trying to do, and what this council did in spring of 17, probably one of the smartest decisions I ever remember this council making, is you decided to put aside funding for that landfill liner. I remember sitting here, I don't know what workshop it was, but I remember y'all said, why are we not saving money for that liner? So that's spring of 17 was when funding for the liner started going into the budget to cover the expense over a period of years. And that's what we're still trying to continue to do, is put money aside to cover that landfill liner so that when we need it in 2.5 years, we've got the cash to pay for it.
Yeah, so I want to make sure we're clear on that, because my understanding was we were accruing it, so we had the cash there to pay it when it come up. But no, we made the decision to start accruing the
Right.
expenses, right?
Right.
So are you keeping that accrual on the general fund side outside of the
No,
enterprise fund?
it's all
Or
in
you-
the-
It's only in the enterprise fund?
It's only in the solid waste
And it
fund.
has been there for
2 years.
2 years now?
Right.
Right, but now that accrual has not been covering the complete cost of the liner. It was
That's right.
covering a
Piece of it.
60 to 70% of it maybe, but not all of it.
Not even that much.
Okay, so there's still a gap there.
And we estimate at June 30th that there will be $352,000 available for liner accrual. Not enough, but something.
So we've got a $900,000 shortfall, not counting closures and liner.
Right.
And closure and liner is estimated at $11 a ton.
Well, really the best way to look at, that's one way to look at it, right. The other way to look at it, we need to look at it, at least for today's purposes, is for budgeting purposes, what is it's going to cost us per year, is the best way to look at that. Because your tonnage is going to change, and when your tonnage changes, so does your price.
So one more time, how much are we missing shortfall? Another 300,000 or 400,000 to cover the full expense of the liner?
The liner, based on what we currently, how we've used it, is going to cost the city about $700,000 a year. So over the course of 3 years, it's $2.1 million. So if you can assume a liner is going to last 3 years, we need $700,000 a year to cover that expense of the liner.
Okay, so I was taking his 2.5 divided by 3, so I was using 833,000 a year. So if you just say 800,000 a year,
Right.
then how much are we accruing today again?
This past budget cycle, we only accrued
$112,000 is in the 18-19 budget. The one before was $240,000.
Okay, so we only accrued about 3,
We estimate by June 30th, we'll have $352,000.
okay, 350 accrual.
Okay, so now we're up to 1.6 million between the $600,000 shortfall, the $300,000 shortfall, and the $700,000 for the liner annually.
Yes,
So that's 1.6. We're falling short just on that.
yes. My presentation goes into this in a little more detail, so we'll be able to
I
see
know, we're
it.
trying to get our mind around it before we get to yours, so we're kind of on the same page and understand it. Okay, all right, continue on.
Well, I guess it might be good just to wrap up here with kind of the overview. So we modeled different scenarios, as was alluded to. We looked at lots of options, the ability to cash fund capital, the ability to accrue money and reserves for the post-closure and closure liabilities. Gentlemen, it's definitely a dire circumstance in terms of have not experienced any other municipal landfill in this type of situation where the risk to bleed the general fund is real. We obviously came up with some recommended solutions of different rate increases, and Mr. Eads will present some of those options for your consideration of exactly what needs to be done, but clearly emphasize two things to leave you with. Number one, the capital cost per unit ton is approximately $4 of cap capital cost for the cell development and lining. That is not necessarily atypical. That's within the range of other municipalities. The cost of operating the landfill comes out to approximately $13.50 per ton as an operation cost. Again, that seems reasonable based on my experience and understanding of other municipal and private sector landfills. But the debt service that's being applied on a per ton basis, about $17 per ton, is really what's unsustainable and causing the fund to experience such dire circumstances.
So what do you have in that capital cost? When you say $4 a ton of capital, what else in that number? Liner, what else?
Liner, there's been a major road and cell development costs, but actually probably not those, because those are sunk costs back in the 90s, the permitting and things like that. So we're really looking at just the CapEx involves the liner, sidewall lining.
So when I took the 800,000 for the liner annual cost, your 2.5 million divided by 3, and then divide that by your 175,000 tonnage going in there, that's $4.55 per ton. So is that your $4 number?
Yeah, approximately.
Okay. And then what's in your operating cost number of 13?
Everything else, it's a number of line items in the
Labor, utilities,
fuel,
fuel,
equipment, leasing.
equipment, leases, supplies, everything else.
Right. Buffer rock, things like that.
Okay, but there was no debt service in the operating cost number of 13 million.
No.
Okay. And you don't have post-closure anywhere in those numbers? That you, yeah. Okay.
And so just one thing that I alluded to earlier, but I do want to emphasize in the form of a graph is, so here looks at the Bristol rate history versus a CPI indexed escalation of rates. And what you see in the green line is the actual historical rates increase through 2018, and then just some projections for the last 3 years here of 2019, 2020, and 2021 based on some of the scenarios that we were evaluating and exploring. The red line is the CPI inflationary escalation. And so while it looks like recently there have been dramatic rate increases just over the past 2 or 3 years and moving forward, what I really want to leave you with or emphasize is that if you consider the time value of money versus inflation here, these rate increases that we're talking about that have occurred in the past few years, as well as what needs to happen here in the future, are just the amounts necessary to essentially catch up to had the city been applying inflationary rate increases the whole time. And so we came up with some recommendations. These were presented to you back in January, and obviously they involve rate increases there.
Bring back that last slide a little bit. Rick, I'll let you know when to pull up mine here in just a second.
Before you move on, Randy, this slide right here, is this the, that's the rate on the y-axis, right?
The rates, yes.
And then the years, so,
The years on the Y,
so if we actually followed the CPI, we would have been at 2018, we would have been what, I can't,
in 2018, you
$26.
should have been 25, and then in 2021, we should be at roughly 35. And that's the reason I wanted this slide up here, because that's going to be a very important number as we continue to move forward through this presentation this morning.
So what would help if we had a dot of where we are? So we're at 22, right?
Correct.
Is that correct?
Yes.
So that's what the green line is. So that gap there is, you know, a good $5 to $6.
From where we should be. Okay, go ahead, Rick, and pull up that presentation. Council, today's budget workshop is in regards to the Solid Waste Disposal Fund. I think there are several things that we need to remember before we even turn to the first slide. Not one of us sitting in this room has created this problem. We're all here looking for solutions, and there are a multitude of ways to get to those solutions. And secondly, I think everyone in this room wants to find a solution, and it's not going to be a pretty solution. And that's just the unfortunate circumstance that we're in. And once again, it's no one's fault sitting in this room that we're in this situation. However, I do want to remind everybody that if we do not fix this problem, it is our problem. So we own it now. So we have to find the solution. I just want to go back over our budget goals. You can see today's discussion is in regards to the self-sustaining solid waste disposal fund. The things in gray are budget goals that were initially presented to me from council. The items in red were things that were later added by council, but the most important one today is the self-sustaining of the solid waste disposal fund. And that block plays a key role in every other block that you see here. That would play a key role in allowing the city to have money to do a jail annex renovation, to make sure our budget stays balanced, to maintain those reserve funds, to maintain the unassigned fund balance. It would give us adequate opportunity to move funds around for funding for CDB. It would allow the city to invest in our employees. It would allow us also to potentially take a portion of those funds, if this was self-sustaining, to fully staff our police and fire department. And it would also allow us to provide for the school system as well, which I know is a top priority for this council. Audit findings. For the past 11 or 12 years, this has been an audit finding that is no one in previous years has done anything about until this council was on board last year with a rate increase. There was, and I think there was rate increases previously, but at the end of the day, the implementation of changes should be maintained to make proprietary funds self-sufficient. So we have not done that, and this is one of the audit findings that continually stays on our audit every single year. I want to remind everyone what an enterprise fund is. It's a fund established by a governmental entity to account for operations of an enterprise activity. Enterprise funds generally are segregated as to purpose and use from other funds and accounts of the governmental entity, with the intent that the revenues generated by the enterprise activity and deposited to the enterprise fund will be devoted principally to funding all operations of the enterprise activity, including payment of debt service on securities issued to finance some activity. This is a reminder of our ending net position from June 30th of 2018. Our net position is negative $20.3 million.
Now, can you explain for folks what net position is?
Next slide.
Okay.
This is the total cost to the total cost of the city. Our outstanding general obligation debt is $34.792 million, plus our transfers from the general fund of $22.15 million, plus our net position of $20.3 million equals a total cost to the city of $77.259. So on paper, the net position shows that the landfill is basically $20 million in debt in regards to everything that has occurred over the life of that landfill. So that's a piece of our net position. Here's a summary of the solid waste debt fund. Solid waste debt fund, that's a true statement. Solid waste disposal fund, or a solid waste disaster fund. The general obligation bonds balance as of June 30th was $34.7 million. There was an unamortized premium of $160,000, capital leases of $240,000 roughly, landfill closure liability of $8.6 million, which basically means we should have $8.6 million sitting in the bank to cover that liability. Net pension liability is $1.299 million. All that means is, and net OPEB liability, both of those are based on actuarial numbers. We pay exactly what VRS tells us to pay, and that's the position that we're in. You do not want to 100% fund your pension and OPEB liability, and we're funding exactly where we need to be funding. Compensated absences right now is $125,171 for a total of $45.494 million, shows as our solid waste disposal fund debt at this point.
We need to come back to that landfill closure liability since we're talking, different numbers here, and make sure we understand what all's in the 8.6, because that's a little different than the other numbers we were talking about.
Your 8.6 is where we should be at today if we had been funding this from day one. That would include covering, out of this 8.6, 3.1 would be immediately available to cover the current closure of 498, and then the remainder would be reserves that have been built up to cover the monitoring of 498, plus you would have funds available being set aside to cover for the closure and post-closure of 588.
What items make up the capital lease line?
Basically, that's your equipment at the landfill that we use. That's your bulldozers, bobcats. We have several items on lease up there.
Okay.
We'll go back to the solid waste disposal fund, general fund transfers. You can see in fiscal year 15, there was $986,000 that was transferred over to make sure the solid waste disposal fund was self-sufficient. In fiscal year 16, $445,652. 17, $785,000 was transferred. In 18, $886,000. And then this past year, or current year that we're in, $567,480 is being transferred. Yes, sir.
And just to be clear, those transfers are not debt payments. Those are just to basically break even each
That's
year.
just to make the landfill break even. That does not include the $375,000 that the city pays for the trash that we put into the landfill as well.
So when we say break even, that's where I want to make sure we're even on the terms here. So when you transfer that money in, so you're covering the difference between the revenues they're creating and the expenses taken to operate the landfill, plus the cost of the liner, right?
Right.
And the debt service is included.
There's no cost of liner involved in any of these transfers.
Okay, so if there's no cost of liner and there's no post-closure in that transfer, so those numbers are in addition to what's needed to just operate the landfill.
That's correct. So, option one, as I said, this is not going to be pretty. None of us created this problem, but this is where we're at. Based on the fact that if the landfill does not sell, which we're currently working on opportunities for that, but if the landfill does not sell by June 30th of 2019, in order to cover all everything that we have talked about to make sure that there are funds available for everything that we have discussed, you would have a rate of $44 per month on your residential waste. Now, what does that cover? That assumes your disposal revenue stays constant at $3.3 million. Your disposal revenue basically consists of your commercial haulers, compost, selling compost, and tires and things
Hang
of
on a
that
second.
nature.
Let's wait till, Bill, you needing something to get caught up?
I just noticed y'all had copies of the slides. I didn't have one.
Bill needs a copy of your
We got it.
slideshow there. Okay. It's here.
Okay. Somehow I didn't get one.
You want me to back up or you?
No.
Okay. All right. go
So
ahead.
your collection revenue at a $44 rate, and your collection revenue is completely separate from the disposal revenue. Collection revenue is what residents pay for the city to pick up their waste. If you went to $44 per month, your collection revenue rate would increase to $3.581 million. Your non-operating revenue, which covers transfers from the general fund, that covers a piece of the local bond, that also covers your liner accrual, would be at roughly $1.55 million for a total revenue of $8.4 million. Your disposal expenses, that's $4.7 million, which would include some of your liner. That would include your liner. Your collection expenses is $952,000, which is basically the same as it is in your current year budget. If you have your budget book available, you would see that. Your non-operating expenses would increase to $2.782 million, which is that piece of the post-closure and closure liability, along with some of the debt as well. And then, so for total expenses of $8.4 million. So what does the $44 per month rate get the city? That allows us to buy $2 million worth of liner for 1920. It allows the city to set aside $602,000 for post-closure and closure costs. It also allows for $700,000 of future liner accrual, and it also allows us to set aside a little over $1 million for future closure accrual. Now, I want everyone to remember this $44 rate is not an end-all be-all. At this point, we would still need to look further down the road to make sure we're meeting what we need to do, so there would still be a rate increase in fiscal year 2021.
Okay, can you explain the non-operating revenue one more time?
Non-operating revenue is your transfers from the general fund. That's local bond money that is currently has been set aside that's available to use at the landfill, and that's your liner, cost of your liner plus your accrual for your closure and post-closure costs.
So that means even under this scenario of $44, we're still having to subsidize and transfer some money from the general fund over?
That's correct.
So what's the rate to where it's completely self-sufficient?
It'd be over $50-some a month.
Okay, you don't have a slide for that?
I do.
You do, okay.
But it also includes getting rid of there would be no disposal revenue at that piece. And that's based upon discussions I've had with council over the past week in regards to an option that they wanted to look at.
And this $2 million on the liner you're showing there, that's including money you need today to buy the one we currently need,
Right.
right? It has nothing to do with putting money aside for the next liner.
Well, it does. There's $700,000 that would be set aside for the next liner as
No,
well.
that's the future liner accrual.
Right.
In the $2 million, that's just to get the.
This year's liner, right.
Yeah, and so if we give you $2 million, then that, based on his numbers, if we get 2.5 years out of it, or 3, then that has a liner in the landfill good through 2023.
Yes.
And while you're waiting on that to show up, you're accruing 700 next year, 700 the year after, 700 the year after that, right? 2020, 2021, 2022. So now you've got the money to buy the next liner.
Right.
So that's the way you've got it laid out. Am I right?
Yep.
Post-closure, the 600,000, that's the post-closure of which landfill?
That would be an accrual of both landfills.
So does that include just the monitoring, or is
That's everything.
that include the 3 million for the capping?
That includes, your post-closure is separate from your closure. Your post-closure is the monitoring of the landfill. And then your future closure accrual is for the actual capping of the landfill.
Okay, so I've got the post-closure, I'm trying to get my mind, so I got the post-closure at $3 million divided by 30 years for the old landfill. That's 100,000 a year.
Right.
And then he gave me a number which is a little different, but I'll call it 6 million, it's 5.9 million, he said, for the current landfill. So 6 million divided by the 30 year, that's another 200,000. So is that 300,000 to do the monitoring? So then that's 600,000 and 300 is what I'm trying to reconcile.
The 600,000 is what the $44 rate for 1920 allows. We're not separating it by actual pieces. We're trying to get, first of all, we're trying to get the post-closure closure liability caught up over time. So it's a total amount.
So some of that's catch-up.
All of it's catch up right now.
Okay, so is that catch-up like this year and the year before? Is it 2 years of is it, or is it what it?
Ideally, we would continue to catch up until we equal what is accrued each financial statement cycle. It's accrued based on the use of the landfill, the percentage that it's full.
Okay.
So at this current rate, it would take 8 years based on the June 30th, what's in the capper. It would take 8 years to get to where we should be at today.
All right, and then that future closure, is that both the old landfill at the 3 million is And so how did you do that? Did you take the 3 million, which we haven't paid or accrued for, and broke it down by, divide by 3 years or
That's
something?
accruing to get us up to where we should be, that's correct.
So if we take the 3 million and divide by, if we want to have the money to do the capping, to pay the capping fee, you could set aside $1 million a year for 3 years.
Right.
That completely covers that. So then you're not setting aside anything for the current landfill.
If you
Or-
look, correct, that's one way to look at it. Now, I think this model assumes that there's going to be a 10-year extension on the 498 landfill, is that right? Yeah. So based on discussions we continue to have with DEQ, we're not expecting that we're going to have those closure costs by the end of December 31 of 2019, or 2020, I'm
What are
sorry.
they saying now? What year?
It'll be a 10-year extension, so 2030.
So,
That has not been officially approved yet, but we see no reason at
So
this
that
point.
means you'd have to have 3 million when you wake up 10 years from now, right?
Right.
So now you're having to set aside 300,000. Is that right? 300,000
Yes.
a year.
But if we do not get that approval, we have to do $3.1 million this next fiscal year.
That's correct, but I see no reason at this point as to why they will not grant that approval. There's several factors that play into that. It's the fact that we're mining 498 to use that 498 as cover in our current landfill, and they understand that's a benefit to the city, and we continue to mine that. We have to continue to show that we're mining that landfill to meet the DEQ standards, and as long as we're doing that, at least from my discussions, and I think Wallace's discussions as well, there's no reason DEQ is not going to extend that. Now, what I will say is I would not count on another extension after 2030.
when will you know for sure?
I think it's July, is what they've told us.
So, do you have a total, I think maybe the closure cost, I think, is total, but post-closure, I mean, where we need to get, because what I heard you saying, this will get us caught up for 8 years, but then it sounds like, are we doing what we should be over those 8 years, or are we just getting caught up to where we should be today, and then we're going to look back and be a little bit behind still? And I mean, or in 8 years we be where we need to be?
No, because the landfill will continue to fill up. What's important, though, is that once we get it in the budget,
Yeah.
at some point, once we get accumulated the amount that equals what's on the financial report, at some point then, we will be able to reduce that. It won't always require a $1 million accrual.
So the way I was kind of doing the same thing Bill was doing there a minute ago on the calculator. So if you said since 1998, we haven't accrued anything for the landfill for the closure of the current rock quarry landfill, right? But you should have been doing that. So if his number of 7.6 million really is what it takes to cap it, right? Then you got the 20 years that's in the rearview mirror, and he estimated 27 years until you actually have to cap it, right? So that is 47-year time period. So you divide that out, and you should have been accruing that amount, every year. And so it says that we're $3.3 million behind right now. If you want to get caught up for the 20 years that we haven't done anything, to get completely caught up as we go forward, that's a big number.
Yeah,
Does
that's
that
kind of.
answer it?
If I'm not,
Well,
if I'm
yeah,
not
and I
mistaken,
mean-
in some of the models that they had done, I want to say it's 2026, I believe, is when it showed that you could cut down on that accrual, because that would put us at where we should be.
I mean, yeah.
I think it was
Well, I was just
2026.
going on the 7.6 million.
Right.
So when you get to that point, you've got to cap it. It's going to cost you 7.6 million.
Right.
Right? So we've already operated at 20 years, and now he said we got another 27. So that's 47-year time period, right? That you've got to spend 7.6 or $8 million bucks. So you should be accruing for that to be ready for that.
Right.
When that time comes. And that's how I did my division.
I'm talking about, I want to say, don't quote me, well, I'll be quoted, I guess, and use here, but I want to say previous models that was done, it shows that we get caught up That doesn't include the future accrual that we need to continue, but we
Right.
would get caught up at this rate. I think it's 2026 or 2028, somewhere in that range. And then that would allow you to back off of what your future closure accrual is, because you've caught up, you have everything that you need, and then you just divide it out by the remainder at that point.
So it's 161,000 a year you should have been accruing just to cap that quarry. And we haven't done that for 20 years, so you take 20 times 161, and there's your 3.2
Well, I
million.
want to caution council that the city has done things in regards to this. We're fixing that right now. So when we say we haven't done anything, I just want to caution council that we need to be careful how we say that.
I'm just gonna make sure we're transparent. Either we have or we haven't accrued it.
I want council to understand that we have to be careful how we
Have
say
we
that.
accrued the money to close the landfill or not?
There is cash that the solid waste disposal fund has on hand at the
Okay,
moment.
so some has been accrued.
Right.
Okay.
And I'm going to just clarify, or just add to that, Mr. Eads, very important, there is not a separate account called landfill closure, post-closure. But we certify every year with the DEQ that the city has the ability to cover that. So it's not in its separate account, it will come from, at this point in time, it would come from remaining city assets.
So that's where this money would go, into a separate account, or would it still?
It will go in the solid waste disposal
Disposal
fund.
fund, okay.
And if council chooses, desires to separate that further, we certainly can do that.
I think we do need to do that. I think we need a post-closure closure line item.
We've added a line item to the solid waste disposal fund budget under every option Mr. Eads will present.
You've got these.
But certainly, we have the ability to go further. If you'd actually like the funds, the cash segregated, we can do that as well, once we get through June 30, 2018.
Well, I think all the big cash category, or all the big expense categories need to have a special line item, so it's very clear when you look at it. So the post-closure costs, of actually each of the landfills, the old one and the new one, need to be shown, so you see what you have cash on hand for that and what you're accruing at what rate for that one, and then the other one as well.
I believe we're accruing in terms of dollars to cover the total liability. At this point, and even in these scenarios, we're looking at total dollars here. We don't have it broken down by each piece, because what really I think is important for budgeting purposes is that we begin to get the dollars in there.
Well, what I was saying is, so I'm explaining it a different way. Let's say you've got no cash to apply toward 498 at all. You're zero. So you show that. And then you show what we're going to accrue in the budget cycle, to go forward. But if you do have some money, or you have some money already set aside for that, you show that. So you know what your starting balance is, against that. And then you're accruing, as you go forward. So we're kind of seeing the picture. And if there's a gap there, to do some catch up, it's pretty easy to see it, right? So we can determine, are we 200,000 delta difference or 300, or where are we?
Okay, and my comments on that separate line item there is, this city is financially stronger than it has been in many, many years right now. Everybody thinks we've got $14.4 million sitting in the bank at our disposal. That's not correct. And if we had line items moving that money, showing that, yeah, we've got it, but this is why we've got it and this is where it's at. And, everybody has a budget they have to work in, and everybody knows what their expenses are coming in on monthly and what you've got to prepare for and set aside. Instead of having it all in one lump sum, I believe we do need to start breaking it out into line items. That way, if we got $3 million setting for post-closure, we need to show that in a line item for the landfill. And then that would show our books on this side as we've got $11 million instead of the 14. So the more you break it out, the better people can understand it. So I'm in favor of definitely putting it in a line item.
And I think that leads into the discussion of, if we do set up a restricted fund or an account to take care of the landfill post-closure, we set that account up as a restricted account so that, the money's there and you can't just kind of pull it out and use it for other purposes, so we don't get into that dilemma. So you see what the purpose is, it's restricted, and then you decide every year how much, as you're accruing, you're deciding, okay, at the end of the year, how much we want to put into that account to keep it whole, and then do the same thing next year, so that you'll continue to see that restricted fund for closure it'll grow. So, and that's what we've not been doing, so you don't see it, because there's no money there, and we don't see how far away we are where we need to be, right? Now, the downside, I guess, is if you could set it up to where the cash you have is able to earn interest, or you can restrict the cash in an investment account like we've got here, 5 or 6 million being invested. If you could continue to draw the interest, but it's still restricted to go into that account, so you're not handicapping your ability to have interest on that money that you're setting aside.
If you'll look on page 4 of 5 of the detailed worksheets we have there, under expense non-operating, you will see landfill post-closure care item.
Which page again?
Page 4 of 5 of the $44 option, which is listed as option 1. And by no means are these options in any particular order of preference.
Can you pull that slide up?
That's not on a slide.
But it's in this.
It's in that detail. No. It's in these budget work
Page
papers.
4 of this.
Page 4 of that.
You'll notice the options are listed at the very top of the front
The
page.
top right-hand corner.
Okay, so now I'm caught up. So what do you want to show on
Page
page 4?
4, if you'll go down to account 5,000, you will see that we have now have that line item out for $602,000 for this upcoming year for post-closure care.
And that matches your number right there, right?
Correct. I will say there's been about 20 different drafts, so if there is a typo, we apologize, but we've tried to make sure these match.
Okay, I got you.
So we do have that line itemed out. We can, if council desires, we can go into further detail with that. That's, and the CFO's expert on how much to line item out, but I'll leave that up to her and council.
Okay.
So let's just continue on with option 2. And before I go any further, well, actually, no, I'll say that in a second. So option 2, Rick, it's not changing. Is our battery dead? There we go. Option 2 is a rate of $37.75. You can see in this option that your disposal revenue continually stays the same, $3.33 million. Your collection revenue has dropped by roughly $280,000 with this option. I'm sorry, hold on, I can't do math. $500,000. Non-operating revenue stays the same. Your non-operating revenue, once again, is your transfers to your general funds, local bond money that's left over, liner accrual, and accrual for closure and post-closure costs. Disposal expenses are a little bit less than what they were, and that's simply based on the fact that we don't have the funds set aside to buy as much liner, where you will see over in 1920 the liner that we can afford to purchase at this rate is only $1.85 million worth of liner. You will also see that your post-closure has now decreased from $602,000 a year down to $250,000 a year. Your future liner accrual in this option did increase by $50,000, and your future closure accrual has now decreased by $500,000. And this is in order for the solid waste fund to continue to operate and fund itself. So you can see there's a significant difference when it comes to option 2 as compared to option 1 as to what you're setting aside for future liabilities that you know are coming.
And that's really the big difference. Option 1 is we own and operate the landfill, and we put away a pretty good amount of money for future closure, post-closure, and liner. Option 2, we still own and operate the landfill, and we're still putting some money away, but just not as much.
Right. There'll be a slide that compares options 1 through 4 here shortly that has a line item for each one of those, so you can see the difference as well. But this is a rate of $37.75 for your collection piece. That's what the residents would be paying. That's what roughly the 7,000 residents, or 7,000 households within the city would be paying per month for collection services. We'll just move on to option 3. What is wrong with this thing? This is $31 a month. And disposal revenue stays constant. Your collection revenue has now decreased by roughly $1 million. Your non-operating revenue is at $1.859 million for a total revenue of $7.7 million. Your disposal expenses have decreased. Your collection expenses have stayed the same. Your non-operating expenses have decreased, and that's simply because you're putting aside less money for future liabilities. Total expenses, $7.7 million. You can see on this slide, option 3 as compared to option 1 is still roughly $150,000 less on liner. We're still going to buy the same amount of liner between option 2 and 3, and you have 0 set aside for your post-closure costs. You have $500,000 set aside for future liner accrual. You also have $200,000 set aside for future closure accrual, and what have I missed here? Cash carryover from 1920s, $300,000. So the significant difference here is the fact that you have no money set aside for your post-closure. Your future liner accrual is now $250,000 less than what it was in option 2, and roughly $200,000 less than option 1. And then your closure accrual is $800,000 less than what it was in option 1, and $300,000 less than option 2.
I got a question on this.
Sure.
So in option 1 and 2, non-operating revenue is where we're getting the general fund transfer,
Correct.
the 1.55. So in option 3, and I hate to spoil it for anybody in the audience, option 4 as well, it goes to 1.85.
That's correct.
So that includes extra money coming from the general fund?
That's a cash carryover from 1920.
Okay.
Can you explain that a little bit?
In an effort to try and get the rates down, we looked at every option. And as I mentioned earlier, we do anticipate that, that at the end of the year, 18-19, there will be cash left in solid waste. Not as much as there should be, but there will be some. This was an effort to try and get that rate down further and say, even though we know we haven't set aside as much as we should, although the city could still accommodate it if it had to, we're going to have to use a piece of that $300,000 in cash left over. It's never a good idea, but we're trying to get the rates down to pay toward that liner, because what is significant about 1920, different than every other year, is we've got to pay cash for a liner all at once. So that $300,000 is using some cash left over at June 30th to try and drive the rate down. It's not a good idea, but it is an option.
So that's cash that normally just go to the unassigned fund balance?
No, it's
No.
solid waste disposal cash.
Okay.
Okay, 364 days ago, I stood right here in the same exact spot, and there was a number that I presented that we needed to go to in order to make the solid waste disposal fund operate. And at that time, our rate was $18 a month, and I also requested a $15 rate increase to make it $33 a month. That was exactly 364 days ago. Option 4, $33 a month. And this is in order to put aside money for for everything that we have listed here. You can see your disposal revenue is staying the same. Your collection revenue is now $2.7 million. Non-operating revenue is 1.8, which includes the carryover from 1920. In addition to your landfill liner, your transfers, your local bond money, and accrual for future. Total revenue of 7.8. Your disposal expenses are now at 4.6 million. Collection expenses have stayed constant throughout each one of these scenarios. Your non-operating expenses are at 2.339 million. Total expenses of 7.8. You can see your 1920 liner is still 1.85 million, which means you're buying less liner, which potentially means you may have to buy another liner sooner rather than later. You're setting aside $159,000 for post-closure, which from option one is roughly $450,000 less, and $100,000 less from option two, and it's $159,000 more from option three. Your future liner accrual is now $600,000, which is $100,000 less than option one, $150,000 less than option two. It is $100,000 more than option three. The future closure accrual is now at $259,000, which is just $59,000 more than option three, $250,000 less than option two, and roughly $750,000 less than option one. So that's a rate of $33 a month, which is the exact same rate that I requested last year. Option five, I think I've heard everyone sit here and say this previously. What would it be if we only accepted residents' trash at our landfill? You can see that the disposal revenue has been taken out because there would be no disposal revenue. Your collection revenue would now be $4.1 million. Your non-operating revenue is $712,000, total of $4.8 million. Your disposal expenses are $1.4 million. Collection expenses are $952,000. Non-operating expenses is $2.4. We did not break it down any further based on the fact and comments that we've heard from council in the past that they were concerned about how high we could take the rate. I did not feel, and I don't think, at least from what I've heard previously, maybe it's changed, but I did not feel that $51 a month would ever pass muster with council. So we didn't further break that down.
Is there, and that's the idea of just having our trash going in the landfill?
That would just be solely the waste that you see sitting alongside the streets Monday through Friday that we go by and pick up. That would be the only thing going into that landfill.
Is there also a factor in there, I don't know how big of a factor, but if we're putting less trash in, if it's just ours, I don't remember the differences between our trash and the haulers that
We
they
roughly
bring.
put in 30,000, is it 30,000 tons, 37,000 tons a year? I think is what the city, no, I'm sorry, 7,000 tons. 7,000 tons a year is what the city puts into the landfill. The commercial haulers.
Wait, we gotta get these numbers right. We've been working with 175,000 as total trash intake, and of
Right.
that 175,000, 32,000 tons was residential and citywide commercial and residential trash going in the landfill, not haulers coming in from outside the city limits. So I've been working with a number of 32,000 tons of the 174 is inside the city limits.
And we've got that in writing.
So let's make sure we got that number right. And it's easy to get these numbers confused because they're just, we talk about them all the time, so.
But my question is, does that mean, how big of a factor,
We took in 143,000. We took around 76, and then commercial contractors did that. The rest is.
Based on what we have, Bristol, Virginia, and this is last year's numbers, and I think that 175,000 number is too high, to be quite honest. I'm not sure where that number came from, but last year we took in 143,546 tons of waste to the landfill. 7,659 of it was waste from the city of Bristol with residents. 7,500 was commercial haulers within the city of Bristol. So you've got roughly $130,000 or 130,000 tons of waste coming from other municipalities.
All right, so go through those numbers one more time so I can write these down.
143,546 was the total that was accepted into the city landfill last year.
That's total. Okay,
7,659 tons was city residential waste.
okay,
7,500 tons was commercial waste within the city.
and the reason I was asking about that was just my thinking, if we're putting less in, how big of a factor is it? So does that mean instead of buying a liner every 3 years, we don't have to buy a liner?
At this
For
rate, you
10
would buy a
years.
liner in 26.82 years if you only put the city waste in.
And would that mean,
Gotta have good information.
instead of the landfill being essentially full in approximately 27 and a half years, we'd have another X amount of years that,
You would extend the life of the landfill exponentially. That number, I think it extends it out to 50-some years, if I'm not
So it's
mistaken.
way more than that. We got to get the numbers right. So that's what we're going to do today. We're going to get these numbers right because we can't make decisions when there's different numbers. So if we have 143,000 is the total tonnage, which is different than your 175. So the consultants had a total 175,000. So we got to reconcile that difference. Okay? And then you're saying between residents and commercial businesses,
Right.
it adds up to 15.1 tons inside the city limits. And we were given previously a 32,000 ton.
Where did that
So
number
was
come
different.
from? I don't know where that came from.
That came from our discussions here in the last probably month or month and a half when we got some emails sent that broke it down, and we had the 174 was broke down into the 32,000, and whatever that difference is was the difference between the residential collection and the commercial disposal that's going in up there, the haulers, basically.
I believe I have that in the vehicle out in the parking lot.
Maybe when we take the recess, could you get that? That way I can see where it came from.
All right, let's take a break.
Okay. Take a break? All right, cool. We got coffee made?
Of course.
Back in session.
Okay, so we were talking about option 5, which was accepting only city trash, and there was a discrepancy in how much waste is produced by the city. The numbers, and you all have these numbers, Kevin, and I may have sent it to the entire council, but there has been a waste collection report that was sent out that shows what we accept on a monthly basis up there at that landfill. And total, there's about 15,000 tons of waste that goes into that landfill that's generated within inside the city. And if that's the case, your landfill extends out about 125 years from today. With that, and it extends your landfill liner out to about 26 years. Now, the problem with extending the landfill liner out 26 years, it's not being protected from UV sunlight, which will cause that to deteriorate over time. So I think expecting a liner, at least the portions that are not getting covered up, to last 26 years is probably, that's an absolute best case scenario as to how long that liner would really last over a
Do
period
we
of
know
time.
from the manufacturer where they would say
We
the
can-
life of the liner is out in the environment?
As we worked these numbers this week, we came up with a whole new list of questions that we got to find out. So
Okay.
that's just one thing we haven't found out yet.
Because the 125 years you mentioned, my number's even different on that. And the way I came up with it, I took his, 175,000 tons and 27 years.
Right.
Right, so it says that you got 175,000 tons times 27 years, that's your capacity left, right?
I do 143,000 tons because that's actually what's going into the landfill on average is
Okay.
143,000 tons. And I used a lifespan of 26 years, so 143,000 tons times 26 years is roughly 3.78 million tons.
Yeah.
Divide that by 15,000 gives you about 123.
I get 247,
Yeah, well, is it two? Yeah, maybe it is 247. So,
yeah.
did you do, hold on a second.
I just took 143,000, right? Multiplied by 27 years, that says you got a capacity left up there in that landfill, basically 3.8 million tons of trash that you could
Yeah,
still
it's
put in there.
247.
Right? And then you divide, so it turns
Yeah,
into a
I've got it.
247-year lifespan if you take all that other away, just the city residents are just putting 15,000 in.
But lifespan is not going to matter to us unless we're willing to charge $51 a month.
Well, I disagree because one of the scenarios we got to look at is if you do that scenario, right, you're changing some of this amortization we're talking about.
We've done that in these analyses.
Post-closure changes way lower than what you're showing, and the liner changes way lower. So we got to understand that a little bit.
Well, you've still got to account for it. And would you get lower than 51? Potentially. I know you could based on that.
I'm going to interject right here. That 51, and as Mr. Eads said earlier, we stopped there. That does not include It does not include any accrual for the liner. It does not include post-closure cost, because we didn't add that back in there, because when we saw 51, we felt like that wasn't sustainable or achievable at this time, so we stopped that. And it certainly makes sense that you wouldn't put a liner accrual in there, because if you're looking at 20 years, that dollar amount is although
Insignificant.
although significant, but it's so small
Right.
that that's not in there. What's important, and Mr. Eads talked about this earlier, was when we got to this rate, we stopped that process.
One thing, and I'll say it now because it seems good time, but in looking at all these, and I think I mentioned this the other day when we had a discussion with Mr. Eads and Ms. Spradlin, but it looks like one of the things that really needs to be done here is some kind of breaking this out on a fixed cost and a variable cost. I mean, that, there are certain things that we're going to need at the landfill, if you bring a napkin across the scales, there's going to be a certain amount of cost. But then with the tonnage and stuff, as you bring more in, what's the cost? And then, of course, hopefully there's a lot of offsetting revenue for that. But I think that would help clarify some of this when you look at different options and scenarios, because and I know y'all were working on that, but I don't have, it doesn't seem to me there's a real good handle on some of that.
Well, and that's part of the rate study that we need to do to determine exactly what we should be charging for each ton. But when you talk about fixed costs, which is your operations and your maintenance, it's basically everything that's an expense there, because there's an option 6 that I have not made public yet. But when we started looking to determine whether or not my option 6 would work, and I'm still working on that, I think I've made you all aware that there's a potential option 6. It's still going to cost $1.4 million to operate that landfill, regardless.
Don't describe option 6 again. What's option 6?
That, for proprietary reasons, I don't want to disclose that in public.
This is the email that you.
So,
But those are the operational costs, but you still have I think you mentioned, Ms. Spradlin, you haven't factored in debt or closure.
None of that's factored
any of
in.
the crew, so those would be, I mean, you've got a certain amount there that you're gonna have to
right.
factor in
But
as well.
But the reason we stopped at this is simply because it was $51. And so when I've gone and looked at option 6, and we'll just go to the next slide here.
Mr. Eads, can I correct myself? I misspoke, and I'd like to correct myself now rather than later. Option 5 did not include a liner accrual.
Yeah.
It included the debt service
Oh, it did?
payments.
Okay.
It included the debt service payments. It included a $250,000 annual post-closure set aside. And I apologize, we stopped before we did the liner accrual, because the thought there was we're going to buy the liner, and as Mr. Eads mentioned, it's going to last for a significant amount of time. And we stopped at the 51. I misspoke, and I apologize.
Well, and I guess that gets back to this option, and what the mayor is saying, though, is some of that becomes more, the liners, the closure and stuff becomes variable, because you got to look then at what the life of the landfill becomes. I mean, so you're spreading those costs out, maybe in this case over a much longer period of time, but some of these you might be contracting that period of time as well. So it's going to change, and that's what, to me, it would be helpful to kind of understand how those costs break out in terms of fixed and the variables. And the variables that are driving them. I mean, you just assume it's tonnage, but it could be something else.
I mean, I guess the only true fixed cost we have is the historical debt service we got to pay on the payments going forward. That's really the only true fixed cost we have. Everything else is semi-fixed. Semi-fixed meaning there's a fixed portion potentially, but then there's a time period fluctuation that would change the variable portion of that. So it's really considered semi-fixed. And then there's truly variable, right? There's some costs up there that are truly variable. If you're not burning as much fuel to run the equipment to process the amount of trash, then you don't buy as much fuel. So that's true variable. So that's the level of detail, unfortunately, we're gonna have to back into to
Well,
really understand
we
what we need to
backed into
do.
that this week in regards to this option 5. We went line item by line item, what can be reduced if you only accept city trash. Fuel was one of those. It goes from $175,000 a year, and we just assumed I could reduce that by 75,000 at 100,000. We don't know. You still got to have equipment up there running. You can't just put trash in there and run equipment one day a week, because every single day DEQ requires cover to be put on that. So those items are going to be running no matter what. Maybe not over as large an area because you're not accepting as much trash a day, but you still got to run those that equipment. So we went line by line, and we reduced, I don't know, what, half of those line items probably. Depending on what the line item was, we reduced it by half to 30%. And you still have disposal expenses of $1.4 million up there. That's just what it costs to have that landfill. You can go through that line item as many times as you want, but if you want to operate the landfill within the confines of DEQ regulations, it's still going to cost $1.4 million. And that's, I think we decreased staff down to
And what's
5.
your 1.4 million again? What makes,
That's your disposal expenses associated with just operating the landfill in and of itself. So you can look at any of the
is that,
budget work papers. That's going to be your salaries. It's all the benefits associated with it, contract labor, professional services, environmental expenses, maintenance of building and property,
so when you look at
maintenance.
total expenses on page 2, right?
Right,
Down there.
2.9. So you can reduce that down roughly by $700,000 just by accepting city-only trash.
So which column are you looking at, 2019-20?
Do what now? I'm looking at 1920.
On page 2, 2019-2020 original, you go down to the bottom, it says
Right.
total expenses 4.7 million. And you got 4.
Oh, that's right. I was looking at I'm sorry.
And of that, 2.1 is the capital. So if you pull that 4.7 minus 2.1, Mr. Eads can do this math better than I can.
It's 2.6, and then you can reduce it down to 1.4. So it's $1.2 million. I'm sorry. I was off on my math.
So it's about 50-some, or you're getting it down to about 50-some percent of it you're going to have to do regardless.
Regardless of what we do, we've got to, as long as that door is open and if we're accepting one napkin a day, it's going to cost $1.4 million roughly to run that landfill. And that was with cutting staff, that was with cutting every expense associated with accepting waste. It's $1.4 million.
So I'm trying to catch up. So if I take the 4.7 million, back out the 2.1 for capital, right?
Right,
That's 2.6 million.
Correct.
Right? And so you're saying you can take that 2.6 million and reduce it
to 1.4.
to 1.4 million if it was just trash going in there that was city,
Correct.
businesses and residents.
Right.
Okay. That's a good number. It's a little different than what I had backed into, but
And when we originally.
we're at least in the ballpark. You might be in the center field stands and I'm out in the middle of left field somewhere, but we're getting close to the same number.
I was going to say, if you said you were on home plate, I was going to say you're wrong.
I'm out in the middle of the outfield somewhere, but I'm not quite to the fence.
Because I dream about these numbers, so I think about these things
Just need to know
quite
where
a
the warning
bit.
track is.
No.
So let's just, and what we have to remember, gentlemen, all because we choose one option today doesn't mean that we'll have to choose this option next year. And I'm not saying we make a decision today, but remember, I've got to present my budget in a little less than 10 days from now. And so I need some sort of guidance on where we want to move forward for this upcoming budget year. And with that being said, let's just compare options 1 and 4. Now, my recommendation is either going to be option 2 or option 4 is the way I think that we need to move forward, at least for this upcoming budget cycle. And here are the main differences that we talked about throughout the presentation today. You've got on your top line, your 1920 liner, how much can we buy? So the less money we spend on a liner means the less liner we're buying, which means we'll probably have to buy a liner sooner rather than later. Your post-closure costs, you're setting aside varying amounts depending on which choice you choose. Your future liner accrual, that all stays relatively constant. It's not exactly where we would want it to be, but it's relatively constant. And then our future closure accrual, you can see varies differently depending on which option you choose. In my opinion, option 2 or 4 are the best options for the city right now. Option 4 is basically what I recommended last year. Option 2 it costs a little more, but it also allows us to set aside future money for liabilities.
All right, I have a couple of questions. We get all these papers, and it's so hard to keep up with all these numbers. Can you tell me what the city, between the taxpayers and the ratepayers, what that total annual number is that the city is paying right now?
Now, when you
keep
say
that landfill
taxpayers
open?
and ratepayers, there's a difference.
I know there is, but the
Okay.
taxpayers are subsidizing.
Your
ratepayers
taxpayers are roughly
paying.
subsidizing 900 and some odd $1,000 to the general fund, from the general fund into the solid waste
But the
disposal.
total general fund and the total ratepayers, what's that number for the city?
You're looking at the current rate, $1.85 million is generated by ratepayers. That's what people are generating on the collection side. And then in regards to general fund taxpayers, they are putting in an additional $925,000 roughly. For a total of 2.77 million.
2.77. Okay. All right, we definitely have our work cut out for us, and we definitely gotta figure this mess out, because we have been talking about the landfill for quite a while now, and we had this 80-20 ratio that we've talked about.
Right.
Well, with these new numbers that's presented today, it's actually a 90-10. It's actually 89.5 to 10.5%. So it's even far worse than I even thought. Because if 143,000 tons is going across those scales, let me get back to the new numbers. If 145,546 tons is going across those scales, and 15,000 of it is city, between residential and city commercial of 15,000, that's a 10.5% of the total landfill waste going in there. So you might as well round it off to a 90-10. And yet out of that 90-10, $2.2 million, $2.77 million today is being paid by the city, and $2.5 million is paid by outside haulers.
Mr. Wingard, what I have is, in this current year budget 18-19, you would have roughly, where did I get that? Okay. 18-19 budget, total revenue generated is $4.852 million.
$4.85 million.
All right. And if, based on, you take $7,011, or 7,011 people, multiply that by 22. I'll just do 7,000 for easy math. Multiply that by 12, and multiply that by 0.95. You have $1.755 that's generated in the collection piece of it, what I call the ratepayer. Then, in regards to what is being subsidized by the general fund, is roughly $925,000. So you take your 5 million, add $925,000 to that. That's 2.68 million. So when you have a total of 2.68 million out of 4.852 million in total revenue, I have the city ratepayer, taxpayer is producing 55% of that revenue.
Let me think of this a little different way, because, you know, I know you said before there was, because the collection, that part, you're not only disposing of it, you're collecting it. Whereas the outside stuff, we're just disposing of it.
Right.
We don't, so there's a cost there, and I think you said that we're having to, you know, that would be my question, is how much of that, you know, is it just to collect the items, or are we also factoring in the disposal cost as well? For what we pick up, for what when I put the can out to the road, I mean, is that just the cost of making sure that gets picked up, or is it also factoring in disposing that? Because
I don't think the city has ever done a study to determine exactly what it costs per can, per trip, to put that waste into the landfill. That's what the landfill study would do. It's something we're trying to drill down to, but there, you know, to say, because I guess the average weight per can is what, 100 pounds? So over the course of, and I don't know if every can gets full. I mean, you have no idea. I mean, one person may throw one bag of trash in there. There's going to be a certain fixed cost just by having the truck run by, but then there's going to be another variable cost in regards to how much each person puts into each can. So one, we've got to drill down what's it cost just to run the truck by and pick up a can empty, and then what's it cost us to run a truck by and pick up that can full, and that's going to vary based on the amount of waste that's going into that.
So I was talking to Bob just a minute ago, and it seemed to me, and correct me if I'm wrong, but the actual collections, the revenue, and operating the landfill, the expenses, that part's not really so bad.
Now, hold on.
The worst part-
The collection piece is a net positive for the city, okay?
But
So don't,
Well,
The worst
I want to
overall-
be careful that we say it's a net positive, because we do not have all the costs of that landfill in the expense side. So I'm going to sit here and say, we've got to have all revenues and all costs of every scenario looked at to know, is it truly break even, or how much negative is it? Because I think every scenario is negative, every single one of them.
And what we were talking about was the overall worst part of it is the debt payment. The over $2 million, which
Right.
was caused by 20 years of borrowing and paying interest only, refinancing, borrowing more, paying interest only. That's ultimately the worst part of
right,
everything.
if you just look at the straight numbers as they are in the budget, it shows that the collection piece generates, I can't remember off the top of my head, either $700,000 or $900,000. It's to the positive every single year, okay? So when you bring in the landfill piece, you got to look at them, you have to look at them as a whole, but you also look at them individually as well. So under the collection side, it's a positive. The disposal side is a negative. The disposal negative side is far greater than the positive on the collection piece.
All right, and that, going back to your 55%, you are correct on that. 55%, the city is covering the cost. 45% is outside.
Correct.
But even with those numbers, only 10%, even though the city's paying 55%, the city is only using 10% of what's going in there.
Right.
So there is a huge misbalance.
So that's the big problem with all these scenarios, which I was going to bring up, is that fact right there. So that's why it was important to get the tonnage breakout, city, residents, commercial, businesses versus everybody else, because if it's 32,000 versus 15,000, that percent that citizens and businesses are really contributing to the overall expense is different. and revenue side. It's a much different number. You see what I'm saying?
I get what you're saying, but this is where we're at. I mean, it's not a matter of, I mean, there's only so many ways you can skin this cat, and at the end of the day,
No, but when we make statements like it's positive and all that kind of stuff, you got to have the revenues and the expenses associated with collection fees in the city dispersed properly, right? Based on the percent of usage in that landfill versus, the way we're doing it. So, and we've not done that yet. So we've not laid it out of what percent of that asset are we really using as citizens and businesses, and how much of that expense really is our expense versus all the other trash going in there.
well,
That's the breakout that we don't see the picture real clear
I
at.
mean, based on it being 10%, 10% of our total expenses for disposal, when you've got a expense line of 2.5 million plus so it's roughly $6 million. So $600,000 if you want to base it on tonnage. So then you take $600,000, divide that by 7,000 people or 7,000 residents, and divide that by 12. Then you're looking at $7.14 if you use that analysis to determine what your monthly rate should be.
So is that was one of the questions, is 7,000 the right number for citizens plus businesses?
Just citizens.
So of all of the $22 rate fee, the $22, how many unique citizens plus businesses is paying that fee? What's the number?
Right now, the business piece is separate from the citizens.
Okay, so citizens,
So citizens, you've got 7,011 to be exact.
7,011 is paying the $22 today, right?
Right. There may be some in there too that have a reduced rate. Overall, you say 7,011, I think there's roughly 6,950 that pay the full $22
And then businesses?
Why do they have a reduced rate?
based on income. They have the opportunity through the Commissioner's Revenue's Office to ask for a reduced rate based on their income.
And retired.
And then how many businesses, 500,
Mike, how many?
1,000?
The collection department is roughly 132 commercial accounts.
132?
That's a good estimate.
Okay. Do you have an average for the rate per ton of those? I know it might be a little different because their waste
I
stream
think,
might be a little different.
what is it, $60 that we're using per canister for $80?
Per quarter.
This is the can rate.
I have a question.
Sure.
So
So we've got
every option we've talked
132
about
using
has to do
cans.
with increasing the rates for the citizens of Bristol. But
So it's
Bob, I
8.
remember last time we talked, there was that
65,
elasticity
and you say it's
model.
charitable.
Is there any possibility
Yeah, right here,
to
commercial right here.
get the tipping fees?
Before we
More.
answer that, let's make sure everybody's listening.
Oh, I'm sorry.
The question was, is there any way to increase the commercial hauler rates that are coming in from outside the city? There's that elasticity model that shows there are some current contracts that have no ability to increase that rate. There's others that show we could increase the rate on certain other localities or businesses. And your question is there an opportunity to raise the rate? Yes, there's an opportunity to raise the rate. Then the question becomes, what do we lose once we raise that rate? So to sit here and try to model the residential rate structure based on a potential on a commercial side, I think would be foolish, simply because we don't know what that loss would be. We could go up to we'll throw out this example. It's been tossed around. We have a flat rate, commercial rate, say $30 a ton. All of a sudden, we may have 0 people bringing their waste in from outside. So if that happens, you still have all the expenses associated with the disposal and the collection piece, which gets you back to that $51 per month, okay? So if we say there's gonna be a certain rate, and that's just market, we gotta deal with market conditions as to what each commercial hauler is gonna pay. So for me to sit here and say, yes, Mr. Farnham, we can raise these rates by $2 a ton, and I know that we'll get X amount of dollars in here because of that, I don't think I could do that and give you an exact number. What you can do, though, is once you stabilize those rates, we can come back and look at the residential piece to see if there's any opportunity where we could lower the residential piece.
But there's some analysis. I think that question is a good one, and we've asked that question already. We haven't come to grips with that number, but that's absolutely a question that's got to be answered, because we can't say that, you know, there's price elasticity, and if we go up or lose customers, because right now where we sit, we don't know where that point is, and that's just part of the business cycle. You have to know where that point is. So we've got to make some assumptions. A scenario like, let's assume the Bristol landfill didn't exist. Where would each one of those commercial haulers have to go to, and what would they have to pay, you know, at those other facilities? So somehow we have to understand that, because right now it appears when you look at some of the ones that group showed us, you know, the different facilities around, you know, we are well to the bottom of the scale from the market price that's out there. So a lot of other counties north of us and facilities are above us. There's some that are close to us because they're, you know, almost direct competitors, but there's not a clear understanding, if you go up on the rates, what the true impact to each of those haulers coming in here really is. And you can say it's hard to get, I don't care. We've got to figure that out. Even if we have to go and do it ourselves or pay for it, that has to be done, or we're never going to figure this landfill out.
But that's an inexact science, Mr. Mumpower, because
We know that, but every business,
I
Mr. Eads,
understand
has
that.
to do that.
and I understand, but as soon as we lose one of those contracts, all of a sudden we've got to make up for it.
We all get that.
Okay,
We
I just want to make sure.
absolutely understand that.
I understand that.
We
So,
absolutely understand that.
when that happens, and I come back and say, we just lost a $500,000 a year contract, and I say we need to increase the collection rate on the residential side by $6 to cover that $500,000 loss, I want you to know I'm going to come back and ask for that so that we don't screw up what we're trying to do in the future to make sure that landfill is self-sustaining.
Well, what I'm saying is it's premature to talk about rate increases until you really understand that picture more fully. And so we've kind of scratched the surface on trying to understand that number. And we know for sure it can go up. We just don't know how high the elasticity we can go before we start to do what you're describing, which is drive off, you know, some big customers, and then it makes the situation potentially worse because that revenue goes away. So we're kind of in this no man land right now, right? Trying to understand that, but not really understanding it because we haven't analyzed each of the individual places that those haulers coming to us could potentially go to and what that impact would be if they had to pay somebody else.
I think Mr. Dick and his group analyzed that, and that was part of that price elasticity model, because our biggest competitor is advanced disposal right now. And advanced disposal will tell you that where they're at is not where they need to be. It's a loss leader for them within their company. And as long as they're using that as a loss leader, in my opinion, they're the private sector, they're setting the market rates. You can look at Unicoi County, I think it's Unicoi County that has a facility, is that right? Or is it Carter County? Over somewhere south of Johnson City, there's another facility. Their rates are higher, but they don't have any waste going into it because everybody's going to Advanced or coming to us. And that's the same thing that we have everywhere else. There's a couple other landfills around that are charging higher rates, but they don't have the volume of waste coming
But
because.
so the problem with that discussion, and we've had this discussion before, is, you know, Advance, I guess that's sitting down there, what, in Bluntville area, right?
Right.
So they potentially are charging an arbitrarily low rate because we're sitting here charging an arbitrarily low rate because they have to stay up with us. They have to, if they weren't where we are, right, they wouldn't get any of that business either. So if we weren't in the picture at all, potentially they would go like this.
Right.
Because they could. And so that's the question we've got to understand.
Well, and I think that's the discussion we've had this week with council members and one-on-ones. If all of a sudden we're only accepting city waste, Advanced has the ability to go up on their waste because all of a sudden they've got more commercial waste coming to them. So once they can set that market rate, then by no stretch of the imagination would I ever advocate that once we get out of this business that we go back into it. But you would have the ability to come back in and charge commercial haulers closer to the market rate of whatever Advance would be charging. So that's the discussion that we've had this week in regards to how do you get Advance to come up? Because there's no guarantee that we go up, that Advance is going to go up. Even if we go up, Advance very well may still undercut us.
Well, we're trying to do, and we're not there yet, right? We're kind of in the budget cycle, but to really understand this, there's other landfills kind of like us that are either county landfills or municipal landfills, right? That we could go and get the information for it if we have to, but talk to them and really understand if they're charging $32 or $34 a ton
Well,
for certain
Mr.
rates.
Mr.
Hang
Dick,
on, let me
well,
finish.
but
How is it that they're doing it? And chances are we're going to find that their landfill, the way it's constructed and where it's located, is a lot more cost efficient, right, than our quarry, right, because of the way it's designed. But that's the kind of information we've got to figure out to understand what all those rate prices are from Rockingham County to everyone that he showed in that table. And we just don't have all that detail yet.
But I think I think you do. I think Mr. Dick explained that we are well within, when it comes to liner and operational costs, we were well within that margin of what it costs to operate what I would assume a traditional landfill would be, because from what I've been told, there's only 3 rock quarry landfills in the entire United States. So that means we're one of the top 3 guys. That's a good thing. But we're one of 3. So when you're comparing us to, say, Charles City County, and they've got a traditional landfill that's not in the rock quarry, our operational costs and those costs that they can line out, we are within that ballpark. The problem that has killed this landfill is the debt. It is the debt. Every single time we needed something up there, instead of buying it with cash and appropriately budgeting for these items that we knew we would need and didn't budget for it, we went out and borrowed money. And we've continually borrowed money.
But the reason you have $35 million of debt sitting there, that's a post-mortem reason for how it got you there.
Right.
So the real reason you had to go borrow that money that accumulated over the 20 years was the cost of taking a quarry, right, and getting the capital intake to make it permittable, right, and then the capital it took to put liners in, right, and not ever paying any of that off in cash as you went along, like buying liners, and now you're paying principal plus interest over a 20-year time period, and you wake up and it's a $35 million, nut. So, but the original root cause is the fact that it's more expensive to capitalize that asset we've got than it is most of the other regional landfills that we're looking at that we compete against.
If we didn't have the debt associated with this, I think, at least according to what Mr. Dick has told us, our cost of operating this whole operation is within market standards.
Well, I think we're talking around each other. What I'm saying is you can't say the cost is as good as everybody else when the cost is based on the capital needed to continue to have that landfill to where you can fill it and operate it. And I'm saying our landfill is more costly because you continue to have to borrow money or pay for things in cash that other places don't have to do because it's not a quarry.
But if you listen to what Mr. Dick says, per tonnage of what it costs to operate that landfill, we are within the market standard.
That's correct.
Okay. So we are within the market standard. The thing that's throwing us outside of that market standard is the debt. And we can sit here and talk about the debt and all this and how we got here. At the end of the day, we got the debt we got to pay for.
I know, but I'm saying the debt is there because you have
It doesn't matter why it's there, Mr. Mumpower, simply because it's there and we have.
As you look forward,
we have
let's
to deal
relax
with
for a
it.
second, okay? It does matter because as you go forward, it means you're going to continue to have to borrow money, right?
No,
To
we're
buy the things necessary. You either pay cash or you borrow money, right?
We can't borrow money. We don't have the ability to borrow money.
You're not listening to what I'm saying.
I am
What I'm
listening.
saying is, forget that we have a limitation on our debt ceiling. If we had the ability to borrow money, right, but you have a landfill that you have to do something every year to make it sustainable going forward, you got to buy a liner, you got to pump water out, you got to do all the things we do. You either have to pay for that in cash, or if you don't have the cash, you got to borrow the money and pay for it as interest. One way or another, you got to pay for that. So what I'm saying, that is not only what we've created over the last 20 years that creates the 35 million debt, but it's going to continue because that's part of what it takes to keep that landfill operating. And other landfills don't have that same scenario, right? Because they don't have to buy the liner like we are. They don't have to absorb those kinds of costs that we're having to throw in there to keep it permittable and keep it operational. We may be doing a much better job, say, on the labor side. Maybe we're more labor efficient in how we're moving the trash, so we're making up for some of that because of that potentially. So that's what I'm trying to say.
Well, while the vertical nature of the quarry is unique in some sense, all landfills incur costs for cell development. So one thing that other landfills do when you're, say, 200-300 acres, you're continuing to incur cell development costs that have a lot of earthwork. And this facility doesn't spend any money each time they do a vertical liner expansion in actually excavating for base grades. And so I would represent that all landfills incur that level of capital cost. Yours is slightly different in terms of the actual activities that are done, but you actually have a number of traditional activities, specifically earthwork and moving dirt in order to accomplish a cell development that other landfills do incur. And so I'm not sure I necessarily agree that the activities in which the city has funded through debt are always going to be continued in the future for the cities, and it's not necessarily that different than what other landfills are
I guess what I'm
experiencing.
trying to do is we're getting caught up in where we are today. So let's back up. Let's say this was day one, right, of the decision to get an operational landfill going. And we had the choice between what you're describing, which is a landfill which has lots of dirt work, you dig a hole, you move it, versus the option to go into a quarry. So what are we going to have to put into each of those two places, right, to keep them permittable and to keep them operational going forward? So if we move dirt, is that going to be $1 million a year versus what we've got is more like $2 million or whatever? Or what's that difference? Because if we are the same as both of those scenarios, then the question begs, how did we end up with $35 million of debt? Are they also carrying $35 million of these dirt-moving landfills across the Commonwealth? If not, why not? Did they pay cash along the way? It's less expensive to do it. So we're not connecting those dots. Why is it that all of a sudden we woke up and we ended up with $35 million of debt? Somebody needs to answer that multi-million-dollar question. Why is that?
Well, the reason we ended up in $35 million in debt is simply because when we started this landfill project, they started out $15 million in debt to get the rock quarry ready. That was the initial outlay for that to happen. Now, Mr. Dick's the expert in the room. I don't know, do other landfills expend $15 million in order to get a site ready, in your experience?
Probably not that level of
Okay. So
preparation.
we're already behind the 8 ball when we've expended more than what other landfills expend. Then the problem is, and this is just solely management and council decisions over the past 20 years, instead of properly budgeting and charging what needed to be charged, so starting out in 1998 when they're charging $2 or $3 a month to pick up your trash, instead of actually going through this analysis that we were trying to go through now, it was probably costing them $7 per month is what maybe the true cost was. I don't know, I'm just throwing a number out. But so they're already losing $4 to $5 immediately right off the bat. So that's the problem. So now when they're losing that money, the general fund's got to supplement the solid waste fund. They're not properly budgeting. They're not putting anything in there aside. When we see this in our current budget, we don't set aside money for maintenance of buildings. So the school system's a perfect example. Over the course of 20 some odd years, things were not taken care of. People weren't forward thinking about what we need to do. And by the fact that they weren't forward thinking has put us $35 million in debt because they said, oh God, we need a liner. We don't have $2 million to get a liner. Go out and borrow $2 million. So they do that. And then the next thing you know, we're refinancing the initial $15 million, plus we got $2 million. Now we've got $17 million. And they just continually did that. It has nothing to do with the simple fact that I think, and I'm not an expert, I think there's only one expert in the room. But I think the only difference between our landfill and everyone else's landfill is we went $15 million in debt to start it, and we continually borrowed to operate it. And I don't think other landfills do that.
Yeah, you amortize your cell development costs. Everybody borrows, but you amortize those cell development costs, whether they're vertically through a quarry or more laterally in a traditional style landfill, over the life of the airspace from what you would achieve. And as Mr. Eads suggests, past city decisions, for whatever reason, did not amortize and pay off the debt through the operating revenue that was generated during the life of each cell, the airspace that's created by that.
Okay, so if the 15 million he mentioned, and that's the kind of information I was asking for, so if that's true, it took $15 million, if we go back,
That's true.
to actually prepare that quarry for the first ton of trash you could put in it, and you amortize that at a 5% rate over 20 years, that's 1.2 million a year payment, so that's 24 million of the 35 we're looking at. So that would represent 24 million of the 35 debt we're sitting here looking at. So what's the other?
That's your capital, that's your
11
liners.
million.
That's your liners that they've done.
So that's the
your-
liners.
That's your refinance cost.
So we have to buy
finance.
liners and no other landfill has to buy liners.
Right. And
But
then,
here's
what-
Is that true?
But here's the thing, every time we borrow $3 million for liners, there's an additional $100,000 for finance charges.
I'll show you a perfect example.
Yeah,
if I
right.
can get this
So
thing
every
to
time
work.
we borrow money, this city has borrowed money, it has cost them a fortune.
Where, Rick, I'm gonna kill somebody. Why is this thing not working? This is a perfect example right here. General obligation bonds. This past year, we issued $16 million in debt in regards to that. Previous, there was $14.9 million. It cost the city $1 million to refinance that debt. That was happened every single freaking time they've refinanced
How
something.
many times has that happened? 3 times over 20 years?
I'd be afraid to say.
Oh, no, it's like every other year they're borrowing to borrow money.
Not to refinance, though. A bond.
Yeah, not to refinance, but
Well, they I mean, I know that they've refinanced, and they would borrow and then refinance, or when they refinance, they might include the additional capital in that, but it seems, that's been the thing, and I guess to what the city manager was saying, I mean, the other thing is that what grabs me is that first slide, that for 12 years, you didn't have any rate increase. And I think my recollection is when they opened this, it was always sold on that it would actually generate money because they thought that people would be more than happy to bring their trash in here. And it may have worked that way, but I think over time, they never really did the kind of study that needed to be done to see what the costs are, what it's really doing. And that's where you ended up with that accumulated 27 million from the general fund, that if they had been looking at that as they went along, I don't think you would have seen, you could have stopped that much earlier with some smaller rate increases along the way.
Well,
That's my
easy
guess.
to show
But
where-
that's looking back.
It's easy to
not
show
forward.
where the difference between the 35 million and the 24 to get it going is truly liner, right? Because you bought, $1.5 million, $2 million every 2 to 3 years over 20 years, so you can easily
mean, it
make
shows
the
it's-
most of that money,
I mean-
right? So then the question is, so everybody else doesn't have to do that, right? Everybody else in the landfill business that's moving dirt.
But they don't necessarily need to do it. They account for it, they accrue for it, which we never did. That's the difference.
But they still have to buy liners,
Yes, they do.
the same expense that we have to buy, and
Yes, everybody buys liners to line their next cell and to create
so
airspace.
roughly the same cost that we're doing, and our life is about what their life is based on tonnage.
Yeah, there's a chance that the vertical nature of the Bristol landfill is such that it doesn't achieve as much airspace for the dollar. So you look at your cell development costs, and while yours might be more substantial than a traditional landfill, but yet everybody has cell development costs, and it all boils down to what is the cost that you can develop airspace per cubic yard, and how much tons of waste can you fit in that cubic yard.
I have a question, and Bob, I asked you this a minute ago when we were in recess, but I'd like to ask you again so everyone can hear and think about it. So, big picture, we have our expenses for operating our landfill and our debt, and we have our revenue from the citizens and from our outside commercial haulers. Is there something that we just haven't thought about, some sort of creative, outside-the-box idea that you've seen in your experience any other landfill do to have another stream of revenue?
Right. Right now, to the best of my knowledge, the city has already attempted just about everything in the world of discarded materials and material management. And by that I mean things like composting. So the city right now takes in organic waste that do not go into the active working face of the landfill and provides some revenue. Recyclables, issues like landfill gas to energy have been implemented here at the city. And so while certainly there are some very unique circumstances as far as green energy parks or solar panel fields that landfills as an open space can sometimes facilitate, I'm not optimistic that anything like what you suggest, that there is out there some sort of silver bullet of a solution that will produce revenues. I just don't know of that or see one that would alleviate the need to make rate adjustments.
All right, I'm gonna comment on what you just said right there because we have been producing mulch and compost at the landfill. And at roughly $27,000 to chip every time they show up, and they come twice a year. Okay, I done the math on this last week. If you hired one person with benefits, brought the chipper truck or chipper equipment up 2 times a year, that's $110,000 annually when you factor in salary and benefits. This report that you give us for today, I've been all the way through them, but every one of these line items that says revenue for mulch and compost, we only average somewhere around $40,000 a year in sales. Mm-hmm. So that means from the 110 to the 40, we're losing that.
Well, your 110 is assuming you've got one person solely associated for an entire year dealing with the mulch, and that's not the case. I mean, if we do it twice a year, you've got maybe one employee, I don't know, associated with it for 20 hours total over the course of a year. So 20 hours times their average rate of pay is not going to equate to the 110,000 you're talking about. So if it costs us 54,000, we'll say that's the flat number that it costs to have that stuff chipped. And then you add roughly 2 days worth of pay for someone working up there, that's an additional $250, $300 at the most. So now you're looking at $54,300. Based on actuals of 17, 18, at that rate, we've lost roughly $18,000.
Okay, that's using a 50% scenario or whatever, your hours there. The bottom line is, we don't know that cost because we don't track how long somebody spends on any task anywhere. So you can say they are spending an hour a day moving that brush, or you can say they're moving brush 4 hours a day. We do not know that. Nobody knows that because we do not track jobs. So we don't know exactly how much money we're losing, but we do know that we're losing money on that particular item.
But
because every day we have brush trucks crossing those scales, whether it's coming from this side of the city or that side of the city, every single day. So that means them trucks can only back up there and dump so much, and then somebody's got to get on equipment and move it and rearrange it
How
to make
often
room
do
for the
y'all
next trucks to
rearrange
come
that?
through there.
Maybe an hour a day or take a 4 load or run there, push the brush up and come back. If that.
So that's 240 hours. They're open 240 days a year. This may be high, but 240. And I'll go ahead and calculate benefits in. It's costing $4,400 a year
For man hours,
for man hours.
for man hours.
Right.
Okay, and it's costing us 54?
54.
$54,000 a year? No, 60. Man, I can't even think.
So you're looking at a total of $58,320 in regards to brush. And if we're bringing in 35,000, we're losing 23,000 a year.
Well, it was my understanding that, and I guess it's not just, are we losing money, but a lot of that mulch we use throughout the city. So, I mean, if we weren't doing, my understanding was we were doing this anyway so that, one, we would save cost in going outside. And then after that, they said, hey, why don't we try to sell this to bring in an additional cash, but they originally started doing it so that we wouldn't have to go out and pay. So I think that needs to be factored into this. And I don't know what that cost is.
And then the other piece of that cost is the fact that DEQ has allowed us to use our mulch for road bed and for cover as well. Otherwise, we'd be going to paying a rock quarry for God only knows how many ton of rock to come in and build that road bed.
You can use mulch for cover?
In
As much
limited
heat
amounts,
as it
yes, we
generates?
can. And we can use it to build road base.
I understand the road, but
And we-
I'm surprised you can use it for cover because mulch generates heat.
You,
If it's piled real high, I think it would, but in a thin like layer, no, it's minimal with mixed with dirt.
Could we see that slide again where you
Which
had
one?
options 1 through 4?
I doubt, oh, it's working now. I was gonna say I doubt it because the thing wouldn't work.
So would you say the biggest difference between all the options are just the amount of money that we put away to save for liner, post-closure, and future closure costs? That's the big difference, how
That's
much we're
correct.
saving,
Yes.
putting away? Okay.
And I'd just like to add, keep in mind, option 3 and 4 include a $300,000 use
Carryover.
of cash balance at June 30th from the solid waste. Just keep that in mind.
And that's like using savings, taking money out of savings that we have.
Okay, and all these options is, got the haulers being raised roughly across all
The gate
contracts.
the gate rate is raised to $36, so anybody that comes across that is not paying, that doesn't have a contract with us would be paying $36. None of this includes the potential for raising rates on the commercial haulers.
Where you've got, option 1, you've got, disposal revenue. You clarified that when you first started, that was haulers.
Correct,
And that collection rates was city.
correct,
Okay, so your 3.3 is haulers,
right.
and currently, they're paying 2.5.
Hold on, let me look at my line item. What you have to remember with your disposal revenue, you've also got revenue from your compost, your mulch, and there's other line items in there. The bulk of that is your commercial haulers coming across.
Okay, but
And you can see that-
this
you can-
proposal right here, option 1, your proposal is a $44 rate for collection revenue. And right now, our current haulers are anywhere between 16 to 22 at roughly 2.5 a year, 2.5 million a year, and now that 3.33, what's that gonna average out in haulers?
Well, your hauler rate's gonna stay the same because those contracts at the moment are not changing. What has changed is there's a $6 gate rate increase
Okay, so
So-
you're raising it at the gate.
at the gate. So that's an
Okay.
additional $45,000 in revenue based on current things that are coming across the scale that are not on a contract.
Okay, so the contract under this proposal is gonna stay in place,
Right.
and as they cross the scales, it's an additional $6 a ton.
Now, hold on, let's make sure we're talking about the same contracts here. Any of the contracts that are in a current contract, the ones that are, you just mentioned, $16 to $22 a ton?
Yep.
There is not an additional $6 fee on top of those. What is an additional $6 fee is that $7,500 in, or $7,500, 7,500 tons in waste that is coming across our scales that are being picked up commercially within the city.
So that is more city businesses being taxed even at a higher rate, and the ratepayers being taxed at a higher rate, and your haulers are locked in with no increase?
We can ask for the increase. Once again, that goes to price elasticity. We do not, I'm trying to base this assumption solely on the fact that your commercial contracts are not going to increase, because I cannot give you, I have no idea what we would lose if we go up.
I understand that. So all these scenarios right here is a contracted hauler, 0 increase. All these scenarios.
Correct.
Yeah, because the revenue has stayed the same on every
Revenue,
option.
yeah, every revenue line item has stayed the same. You can see 3.3, 3.3, 3.3.
Okay,
That
and
was gonna be one of my
this
questions.
handout here,
Yes,
so these proposed increases over here,
There was just speculation.
that's speculation.
It's just speculation.
Did that sheet capture every single hauler and the entire revenue base? Because that revenue is different than this 3.2 million. It's much lower than that in total.
okay, just to go on the record
This
and
is
say
solely,
this.
this does not include any of the other revenue items from disposal. This is just solely your commercial hauler revenue items.
Okay, we've got to figure this out, because
Well-
this just is not right. It's not fair to the taxpayer and to the ratepayers and the business people in this city. If you average a can at $100, 100 pounds, is that what you said earlier? 100 pounds for a can sitting at the road is the average. If you pick that can up, that's 5,200 pounds a year for every household that has a can sitting out there. And then you take and divide that by tonnage at 2,100 pounds a ton, that's 2.47 tons that you're picking up at a resident's property. Those residents are paying, right now, at $22 a month, they're paying $264 a year for that can to be picked up at their house. And you divide that by 2.47 tons, they're paying $61.53 per ton. And they are our ratepayers. And we're letting trucks cross those scales at $16 to $22 a ton. And these proposals do not have any increase on a hauler. I'm just sitting here blown away. I want more information. I want a better breakdown at this $51 a ton and go purely private inside this city, because if we're gonna be raped like that, we might be better off just to go completely private.
Then it's gonna be more than $51
You submitted your number 5 proposal at $51.
and that $51 does not include any, liner costs as well.
Yeah, but the
Because
line
we
would last
stopped,
20
we stopped
years.
simply because every conversation I've had in here, no one in January wanted to go up $7. And then why in the world would we go up $30 or $19 when everyone was fussing and going up
Well, I'll tell you
$7?
why I didn't want to go up. I didn't want to go up for one reason. It was because we didn't understand the problem, and we still don't understand the problem. And I'm not going to vote for anything until we really understand the entire picture, the way you analyze financially where you are on the collection side, both residents and commercial inside the city and commercial haulers. So you're just throwing something against the wall and you're just doing a wild ass WAG, right? guess.
Mayor, that is
when you-
absolutely wrong to say that we're throwing something against the wall. We have spent numerous hours on this since October of 2017. We have gone through every single analysis that you can go through. We've got an expert on
No way.
hand, and everybody
Don't
wants to
agree.
ignore what the expert's done, and that's what this city has done from day one. They have ignored every expert telling us what to do. And to sit here and say that we've wasted our time, that is an absolute affront to whether or not you think I should be standing here in front of you. I have done every single thing to come up with every single option for this city to make that landfill right. And I can't help the way it is. This is where we're at today.
Why are you getting so emotional for? This is the
Because,
problem
Mayor,
we've got.
I have wasted,
There's-
I won't say wasted, I have spent numerous, I can't count the hours to come up with solutions. And every time I come up with a solution, I get told we've got to do something else. And there's only so much that we can do. I've got to present a budget in 12 days.
Well, to get to the real reason that you go forward with something, it takes a lot of hard work. And so, yeah, you've put in a lot of hours, and so have we. And what I'm saying is, we still don't have a good picture. And you don't want to go making a decision on anything relative to rates for citizens or rates for commercial haulers until you really understand the entire picture from a cost structure. And I'm just saying, of all the work we've done, there is still not a clear picture, and there's more questions than there are answers. So when I say a WAG, we're kind of guessing we are, because we don't really have our arms around like true price elasticity. And where would they go if they couldn't come to Bristol?
But the problem is, I can't sit here and give you numbers that we need for a budget based on what someone might or might not do. I've got to give you what I know right now. And what I know is what we're bringing in from those folks. I could sit here all day long and assume that X, Y, and Z are going to go somewhere else. That doesn't mean it'll happen. So then if X, Y, Z and go somewhere else, that changes your number on the residential side. What I'm trying to do is give as much constant to this as possible with what we know. Because at the end of the day, we have no idea what other commercial haulers are going to do. I've got to work with what's constant. And that's what we know. We're working with what we know, not on an assumption of what a commercial hauler will or may not do if we raise the rate $3. Just for example, we raise the rate $2 across the board. That's an additional $270,000 in revenue to the city, or to the landfill. $2 rate increase. I can't guarantee that if I raise it $2, that every one of those contracts is going to stay with us.
We know that.
Okay,
We get that.
but what you've got to work with is the constant in order to develop a budget. Otherwise, what I'm hearing from two of you right now is we're going to leave rates at $22. We're going to continue to study this, and Wallace, we're not going to be buying a liner.
No, you're not hearing anything from me. We're still talking about
Now,
it.
I think that's what you've said.
No, it is not what I'm saying. Everybody's not understanding what I'm saying.
I can't get you the
Let
answers
me finish.
that- I
Let
can't
me
get you
finish.
the
I have
answers
not
before
said a
March
complete
26th.
rate since I've been sitting here. I've not said I agree with $22. I've not said I agree with $25 or $35 or $51. Right? I'm trying to come to grips with what is the right fair rate. Right? So I'm not sitting here saying I support anything yet. Right? I don't support any of these because I still don't understand them. I'm trying to truly understand them. Okay? That's where I'm at, personally. And so more information is going to be needed before I understand what we should do. That's what I'm saying.
Well, here's the deal. I've got to present a budget in 10 days. And one of these options I'm putting into the budget, and it's going to be voted on. And that's just the way it is, and this clicker's not working again.
Take 5, let everybody cool down.
All right, we'll take 5.
Okay, we've spent a lot of time on price elasticity and how things, how they've come up with a price elasticity model. Without getting into every specific detail of that, I think Mr. Dick is going to go over how they came up with those price elasticity numbers that we saw in January, so I'll let him kind of take over. And then if he can also touch on the fact of the recycles, what's required by DEQ.
Yeah, to the first point, the SCS looked at each one of the contracted haulers. That includes certain commercial, private sector companies, as well as adjacent municipalities. And we evaluated how the parameters that we looked at were the distance and fuel cost and driver cost and transportation cost to go beyond the city's landfill to the nearest alternative disposal facility. We looked at the type of company that it is, whether they had a lot of assets in terms of their fleet, and we also looked at the nature of the fleet, whether it was coming in a transfer trailer or coming in a rear load or a front load or packer truck. And so with those things, as well as, like I said, obviously fuel costs and cost of transportation, then we developed some likely projection on what we thought rates could be increased to the the contracted haulers and customers. But I must point out that that's clearly speculative, it's uncertain, it does not factor in any type of behavioral analysis, which we all use as consumers. We all make decisions about things where we buy gas, where we purchase shoes, everything like that, that doesn't always follow strict economic benefits. But we provided that information as just some basis to consider, but again, the city would potentially be at risk for implementing those, and so you can't take that as just an absolute objective scientific analysis and expect, business people to react exactly along those lines. And then to the second point, there was a statement about taking organic waste, brush, and yard waste, and making it what the costs of that are. And while I think it's well known throughout the solid waste industry that the least expensive thing to do with that material is to tip it and dump it in the working face of a landfill, the city provides a alternative management to generate that and recycle it. And that's one of the activities that diverts that material out of the landfill and goes to satisfying the city's recycling rate. And so DEQ would require that the city meet a certain recycling rate, and that management of organic waste through making mulch and compost achieves that. And of course, it's the more environmentally responsible thing to do with it. Thanks.
So we're at the end of the presentation. I know there's a lot of questions that have to be answered. I don't have the answer to every single question, and we're not going to have the answer to a lot of those questions in the next 10 days. We're not going to have the answer to those questions in the next 90 days maybe, because some of it is just, it's information that we'll just have to deal with as we pass along costs to consumers. But this is where we're at as of today. And it's not pretty. I said that from the beginning. I also said from the beginning, not a one of us in here created this problem. We're all sitting here trying to fix it. And there is no easy fix.
I have a quick statement. And I know we'll probably have a lot more discussion about this going forward over the next days, weeks. But, if it's up for the city council to decide whether we do option 1, 2, 3, or 4, or do nothing at all, I don't think, and I'll just say, if the main option, the main difference between all the options is how much money we're putting away in the bank, in savings, for future expenses, is that pretty much the biggest difference?
That's the biggest difference.
And I'm all for putting away money in savings so we can pay for stuff in the future, but I don't even think we should discuss option 1, because right now the rate is 22, and that's essentially doubling. And to tell every citizen in Bristol your rate is being doubled, I just don't think that's possible. I don't think that should be on the board. Now, as far as option 2, 3, 4, Bob, do you have any thoughts or suggestions about, just going ahead into the future, coming years and coming expenses that are coming up? What are your thoughts?
Well, I think between options 2, 3, and 4, you can see what they target as far as objectives in allocations to the different main categories. I don't think that there's much of a distinction between the actual rate of 31, 33, or 37.75 in terms of the extent to which they cover the cost of service, because the cities provides a very high level of service for the citizens. I think option 4 definitely establishes a position which allows the city to make a financial plan and to look at future escalations. I don't think any of this is a wild guess. I think we do understand the numbers. I think we do understand where costs are incurred and for what reason. And so I think that one is a reasonable thing. I understand that it's difficult to stomach, as all rate escalations are, but I would point out that it happens to all of us all the time with other utilities, whether that be phone service or internet service and things like that, that again, for whatever reason in the past, the city opted not to increase or escalate service fees. And we've heard a lot of discussion about the market conditions with respect to the tipping and disposal fees at the landfill. And the facility is trying its best, I know, to be competitive in the open market there. And so that's my thought, is that they're all viable and rational in terms of the ability to make up the cost of service.
It's ugly to have to even think about having to raise rates like this, but a lot of it just kind of goes back, I guess, to, the lack of inflationary increases for so long, because nobody wants to be bad cop or nobody wants to deliver bad news. And I think the modus operandi for this council, or at least I hope it is that we address problems head on and we tackle them head on, because the worst action is no action sometimes. You need to look at what's in front of you and realize that you can't just, push it off. So believe me, I'm going to pay these. I don't love any of these, but I realize that we have to do something. And I know in the coming days and weeks, we've got to figure out what we want to do here, because you've got to have a budget to us pretty soon. And we don't want you working the night before at midnight trying to figure this out. So we have to do something, and I'm not sure where we're at yet.
Yeah, I would agree. I mean, doing nothing is probably the worst thing we can do. That's a lot of what I think got us here when you came in January and y'all made the presentation. Just keeping up with inflation, you recommended, I think, 7 and 8, which would put us about at the 37, and that's just to keep up with inflation. And that was over 2 years. So, we know something's got to be done. I think, you had mentioned it then. We see it again today. Doing nothing is the worst option. Option 1 looks to solve a lot more problems a lot quickly, but I just don't think that's something you could do in 1 year. I think that's probably what you want to work towards. And the question then is, over the next 2 or 3 years, budget cycles, how do you get there? And by the time you get there, it may not be $44. It may be 45 or 46, maybe more. But, I think, to come up with a plan within that, I would say, again, to me, as we're looking at this and trying to move forward, we definitely need to have that rate study and try to better understand what the costs for these services are, because I think going forward, you might, one, understand the cost, but two, allocate it out better to where people are actually paying for the services they get. Not, some people, if you're, an elderly person that just, has one bag of trash every 2 weeks, you maybe couldn't pay for a lower level of service versus a somebody has a family of 6 kids, and I've seen that in my neighborhood where the trash overflows every week and is sitting there, and I don't know how they pick it up, but I drive by and it's outside the can. I mean, they've got more trash than they need. So clearly those people need different levels of service. I don't know how you get to that, but understanding those fees, understanding the fixed and the variable cost, I think is real important when you look at, especially the different rates of tonnage and what that means, and having a good breakdown for that. And then as much as we can, and I understand the elasticity and the market, but as much as we can to try to inch up those contracts. But again, that's a very inexact science. But I know as they come up and you negotiate those, you try to get them up, but you can only push so far without losing revenue. So that's kind of, I guess, the guidance I would give right now. But yeah, to do nothing is probably the worst thing we could do.
Well, I'm gonna agree that we need to do something, but it needs to be more fair across the board. I mean, it's already been shown today that only 10% of this city's trash is going into that landfill, 10%. But yet it's paying 55% of the bills. It's out of balance. We've got to have some serious discussions. It's just a money pit. And the bottom line is, until we can write a check for that $33 million debt, it's never going to make any money. That is what is killing this city on that landfill. But at the same time, we have to be very careful about how quick we try to raise rates and taxes on the people. We have to remember our position that we have found ourselves in with the poverty rate, with the lack of jobs, with the household income. There are so many factors into play here that we have got to take our time and get our heads wrapped around it. A quick decision could be a disaster. And all 4 of these proposals, 3 of them's being considered. For every action, there is a reaction. I don't care what it is. You can only take your rates up so quick in a certain amount of time until the people just go ballistic. So we have to tread lightly. And we've all known for a long time that this landfill is out of balance, and nobody has truly had the time or taken the time to try to get their heads wrapped around it other than budget time. And then it's just shooting from the hips. So Mumpower and I presented a situation where we could set up some committees, long-term committees and advisory boards to help everybody get their head wrapped around it, to keep it on the table and a topic to talk about all the time. The council shot it down for whatever reasons. So Mumpower and I took it upon ourselves, because we don't need council's approval to meet here to go over stuff and talk about stuff. If we don't get our heads wrapped around this in the next 3 or 4 years, when our true big payment takes place, we're done. But in the meantime, we can't freak out and charge people rates that, one, is going to make tenants move out of the landlord's houses, make homeowners put their houses up for sale and move across the line. Right now, they're being charged at a rate of $61 a ton, and we're taking our neighbor's trash for $22 a ton. We're out of balance, and I understand something has to be done, but we have to tread lightly in doing it. We cannot run these people out of this city by overtaxing them and overcharging them for the services. So that's my position. We're going to have to regroup and talk about this, and I have no problem coming back with this same subject as a topic. Today is Saturday, having another one next Saturday morning. Let everybody take all this information, get it absorbed, ask questions, research, gather, talk, and let's do this again tomorrow, next Saturday. Because this is a beast.
Yep. Well, I got no problem with anything that's been set up here. I mean, we know this problem's bigger than one budget cycle's gonna solve. We've known that for a while, right? And so sometimes when you got problems this big, you gotta back up on a white sheet of paper and say, if we were just at least gonna make one aspect of this landfill fair, what would we do? Well, one thing to really look at is say, we could say, the debt at this point that we've incurred, nobody can do anything about that. The citizens can't do anything about it, commercial folks, it is what it is. It's already built up. But if we were to start clean tomorrow, and we just wanted to charge the citizens the right fair amount to pick up their trash, to put it in the landfill, to pay their fair portion of the 15,000 tons that's going in there, of the total 150, right? What would that rate be? And have it at the right inflationary rate, because we hadn't raised rates from 98 to 2009. So I could sleep at night on that one. That's fair, because we just didn't increase rates forever, so they would have been at some level. If they would have been normally raised based on inflation, what's that number? But take the debt aside and set it, because that's kind of an anomaly. And let's just look at what it takes to run the trash trucks, to pick up the trash, to go up there and dump the 15,000, to move it in the landfill, right? What's the cost of all that? And what should the rate be to be really fair to the citizens and the businesses in the city to cover that number? Because that's what it would be anyway. No matter what else we talk about, you know, to do it right, you would have a number there. What's that number? And I don't know what it is sitting here, but it's a higher number than what the $22 represents. But we've got $22 for citizens, and I think we got, you know, roughly $80 or $90 for the commercial businesses, right, for big containers. So there's a higher average in there, right? Because when you looked at the 15,000 you mentioned, about 50% of that volume is the commercial businesses, right? Well, they're paying a much higher rate than the citizens. They got a container rate, right? So what is the good, fair average number between those scenarios of businesses and us, right? Based on the 7,500 that's going in for each item, and where should we be based on inflation as we wake up today? That should be a pretty easy number we can come up with, because that's fair for the people inside the city, right? Because the rest of it, outside of that discussion, is got a lot of complexity to it, and it's a very difficult answer to come by, because you got to do some pretty serious market analysis on price elasticity. And you got to go some places on the other stuff that we've never been before we could really make a good decision about whether we go up 50 cents on commercial haulers, or whether we go up $1 or $2, or whether we go up $3, because it's no man's land. You could go up $3 thinking you're safe and run off 3 or 4 customers, and then you're 2 steps backwards, right? So it's really risky. And it's more risky when we don't understand enough. So one proposal to think about as we leave here would be, let's figure out what's fair for at least the section of the landfill that we do know, right? That's more solid in our information. And then figure out what to do with the rest of it as we get more information, put together another set of people that can really study this, maybe even pay for some analysis, you know, that would give us some of the data we need, because it's, you know, city staff obviously doesn't have time to sit around and spend, you know, 8 hours a day, every day doing this. So we've got to figure out what do we got to do to get the remainder information to make a good decision on the real commercial, private market, competitive side, so that we either say there is a number there that we can live with and that makes sense from what we're covering on costs, or at least closes the gap, or not, you know. And to me, that seems fairly reasonable. But I don't know what the number is sitting here, because we got to kind of come back and talk about it.
I can tell you on the residential side, if you take what it would cost to operate the landfill with only city trash at 1.47 million, plus we know collections cost us 942,000. You add those two together, you divide it by 7,011, you divide that by 12, that's $28.78 a month for residential waste.
How much?
$28.78.
And that's not including debt payment.
That's not including debt payment, not including any liners or anything, or post-closure.
Okay, all right, because I thought that was awful cheap. So we need to know the number on all of that.
So did that 2870, did you use liner and post-closure in that?
No.
Okay. Because if you said, what do we want to be fair to the citizens, if we didn't have the commercial haulers, well, the citizens have a post-closure cost that we have to pay. But it's going to be, if it was just 15,000 tons going there, it's going to be a couple hundred years plus before you have to talk about that. But at some point, you've got to accrue costs for the closure. Because it's such a long period of time, you may not say you need to accrue immediately for that, but you need to accrue within a 30 to 40-year time period when you get close to that to start accruing for that cost, because all those costs will climb inflationary before you get there. So maybe you just set that one aside until you get closer. But there's other costs that we know we have that we're trying to get in the discussion that we've never put in the discussion to make sure we're covering all of our costs that are true, and then be fair to everybody at the same time. So, whether that number is $28.70 or whether it's $26 or whether it's $30 or one of these options, we got to figure out which one we think is most representative of that number, right? That's where I think I'm at. And I'm good with another Saturday. I'm good with a Saturday plus something else in the week. If we want to do another nightly couple hours plus a Saturday to kind of keep talking about it and get our arms around it, I'm good with that too, so.
Okay,
I'm pretty
I
flexible.
can give you the number right now with closure and post-closure and liner. Liner, you assume I would assume 2 liners over 50 years. I don't think that's appropriate at $4.5 million, but assume 2 liners would last us, and it would if it was just city trash only. And then you assume $19 million in closure liability over 75 years of the life. Actually, let's just go up to $6 million on the liners. And we'll do 3 liners. So, plus-
Containers that that's on that sheet, how many tons are one of those $80 containers?
So they're.
You're at 30,
storage.
if you include the cost of, which gets right back to option 4 and which gets back to March 17th of last year, it's $33.81.
What is it?
$33.81. That's including, assume the landfill closed in 75 years. We know it'll last longer, but just assume 75 for a relatively decent number to consider. So you take 19 million, divide that by 75. It's $253,000 a year you got to set aside for that. You have 3 liners at $6 million. You set that aside for 75 years. That's $80,000 a year that you got to set aside. So the 80,000 plus the 253 plus your 1.47 million to operate the disposal side plus the 952,000 to operate your collection side equals 3381 for what it should cost for a citizen.
3381
Right.
per month. And it's city private?
City private, but that does not include covering any of the debt.
Okay, 3381.
So if you look at, our current fee schedule, right? Because when you talk of that rate, and we talk 15,000, we're actually throwing the businesses in there with the citizens at the same discussion, right? If we charge a different rate, for them to come and pick up our trash at our curbside versus like picking up a small business out here. So we charge for a 95-gallon, container, which you got to convert that to, tons, $80 a quarter. And then for a 300-gallon container, about $160 a quarter, right? So those are much different numbers. So we need to back in, we need to back those back to the, kind of the same unit of measure. So what are we charging, the commercial guys, the businesses in town on a per tonnage basis, right? Versus the citizens at the curbside. That's the way you gotta make it fair, so we're not, because a business has more means to, pay, for trash taken out than a citizens potentially, because they're generating more trash. But we gotta make sure we separate, I think, those two discussion points and reconcile the, does all the citizens or all the businesses in town use a 95-gallon container? I know there's a mixture there, maybe 90% of the businesses do, but some of them might use a 300-gallon. But if you run that mixture, that product mix, what is the true rate per ton that the businesses are paying? And then what's the rate that the citizens would pay? And are those two fair, and are we covering our costs, and are they at the inflationary rate that would make sense from where they have been? So if we know all that, which I think we do, maybe that's where we start. We try to figure out what's just absolutely fair for that, and then we figure out the rest of it as we know more information, because we just can't go anywhere with it right now. What does that sound like to folks? I'm looking for a rebuttal, or that doesn't make sense, or that seems reasonable to talk about in our next couple of meetings, or what?
Well, like I've said and been saying, this thing's a beast, and we ain't gonna get our head wrapped around it in a week or 2 weeks or 6 months. You ain't gonna wrap your head around this one.
Because there's enough.
We just gotta move slow, and we gotta be fair about everything we do, and not freak anybody out.
Right. Because there's enough businesses in town, and I think that at this point in time, they know we want to be business friendly. We don't want to handicap the businesses anymore, because we want them to stay here, we want them to prosper. So they could probably come to us. We could probably get 5 or 10 businesses, say, if we go out and quote what it costs a private company to come by, like Waste Management, somebody to come by and pick up a 95-gallon tote, what they're going to have to pay and how we compare to that. And if they got a 300, how they compare to that. And I think there's probably some people in this room that's done that before. So that would be a good starting point to see, are these rates we currently charge pretty close to right? Or are they a little bit, on the low side by 10% or 5%? And where would we need to be just to kind of be competitive with where the businesses would have to go anyway if they went and quoted a private guy to pick it up? And I know they all do that, because they could go with the city usage or not, just, they're able to do that, right?
I double counted something. It should be 3275 instead of 3381 for, that's just your disposal, collection, liner, post-closure, and closure costs is 3275. And then, if you just wanted to add the debt to the citizens, and I'm just throwing this out there so that we know what it is. To the citizens, it's $33.37 per month for debt, if you amortize what we owe over 20 years.
Yeah, how much is debt?
$33.37.
$33.37, and the service is $32.75.
Correct, and
Okay.
then, so that would take you up to $66 a month if you wanted to include the debt.
That's more in line with the numbers I calculated.
Yeah, I was
Okay.
coming out with $62, but we're all, again, we're in the ballpark. We're getting
Well,
closer to
and
that number,
A study that you have not seen yet is, I think that's what SCS engineers came up with, was $66 per month. Is which we did not present that simply because we know we can't go there.
Well, like I said, I mean, having a rate study and all that, and looking at commercial within, when we talk commercial, I think most of it's outside the city, but looking at those rates and seeing if they need to be adjusted, that, I think, that's part of it. I mean, and that could maybe be done quicker than later, but
But when I say commercial, we have it on our rate fee, commercial, but that's businesses inside the
Yeah,
city. That's
yeah.
not the county.
we're picking it up.
Yeah, but we're picking that
Yeah.
business down Euclid's 95-gallon container, we're charging that much a quarter,
Yeah,
right?
yeah,
So how
'cause-
do we make that fair? Because we should know that.
Yeah, because I
Right, is
think,
it-
well, and that, to me, all gets on the collection side, because if we're picking it up, That's a little different than just disposal people that they've already picked it up, they're just putting it in the landfill.
If you're
So-
figuring $80 a quarter for the commercial, that comes out to, that's a quarter, so that comes out to $26, $27 a month,
Yeah,
right?
but you gotta remember, the problem is the unit of measures are all different, right? This is
Yeah.
$80 a quarter based on picking up 95 gallons. So you gotta start converting the units to
Yeah.
where we're talking tons in both scenarios. That's what's
I think that's
complicated.
worth
And I know,
looking
we
at.
know that number, I can't remember what it is. We went and found on the, there's sites out there, like the EPA site, that, there's numbers that show you how many tons of trash
Trash
equals
equal
a
a
gallon,
gallon.
right? You can convert the numbers and see.
Okay, the regular residential container holds 95 gallons.
Right, 95 gallons,
Yep.
that's correct. But how many tons of trash is that? Because, the 7,500 tons that you showed on that one spreadsheet that those businesses are putting in the landfill, that's tons, not gallons, right? So trying to make sure we're all on the same unit of measure and we keep our discussion understanding what we're talking about is the problem.
Well, he said, 100 pounds a week in a normal container in front of you.
Well, that's what it holds. We don't know if that's what everybody's putting into it. We just know that that's supposed to be the maximum that someone puts into it's 100 pounds. We have no idea if that's what it is. Now, you can backdoor your way into that by 7,500 tons. We know that's what's coming into the city times 2,000. That's 15 million pounds. You divide that by 7,011. That it means one household is putting roughly 1 ton of trash into the landfill per year.
See, there's so many different ways to run these numbers. Because I asked the questions throughout this work session, and the questions were answered to the point to where it was 100 pounds per can. So you times that by 12 or 4,
Right.
and then 52. And I was coming up with each household is producing somewhere around 2.47 tons, and that was not disputed when I mentioned that. And then
That was
calculated
on
my
the,
amount.
that was on the assumption everyone's filling it up to 100 pounds. Because I think the question was, how much does one of our cans hold, which is 100 pounds? But if you take what's actually going in on city trash at 7,500 tons, 7,500 tons, multiply that by 2,000, that's 15 million pounds. And then you divide that by the number of accounts that we have, which is 7,011, that gets you at 2,139 pounds of trash per year. And if you want to take that further down, that's 178 pounds a month. Divide that by weeks, that's 41.17 pounds per week.
Yeah, 41 pounds a week is a good average for a citizen. And that makes sense. My trash probably, I'll roll it out there. I could see it's
All right.
40 to 60 pounds. It's not 100. I probably couldn't move it, but it's the normal green cans, the big, yeah. Well, this is an average, so I could see where the average is roughly around 41.
I must say this because you all are going to get bad figures here. You're talking about one of those humongous trash cans. I can't handle one of those myself. And there are a lot of people in this city besides me who cannot handle those things. So I have the smaller size. And I don't even think you all buy those anymore. But if you get one of the big ones, I will have to pay somebody to come and take my can to the front because I would vanish in the can. You might like that.
That could be a good thing, probably. All right, so, what else?
Can-
Be a concern is a smaller size can.
Yeah, I get it. We get it.
Not everybody can handle those.
Understand that.
Be-
That was just an average number.
Well, listen to Ms. Marnie, and I know we talked about before about getting the public. Would it be all right, Mr. Mayor, to allow Ms. Marnie, Mr. Hubbard, the other couple, since they've come and
Come up and
spent
talk.
3 hours, because
Yeah.
we did say we wanted to hear from people.
You got anything else that you want to go through?
The only thing I was going to just remind you of what the schedule is. March 26th is the public hearing and budget presentation. April 9th, is the tax rate resolution. April 23rd is a public hearing for the appropriation ordinance. April 27th is another workshop. May 14th is the first reading of the appropriation ordinance. May 28th is the second reading of the ordinance and passing of the budget.
Can I ask you one thing real quick
Sure.
before we close out? Just to clarify, you said that the regular residential containers are 95 gallons,
Correct.
so they don't hold 100 pounds? Because if I'm doing my math right, and if Google's not lying to me, 1 gallon is 8.3 pounds. Is that just in, is
That's
that
too
liquid?
much. That's
That's just
way
liquid water?
That's just liquid water.
So when we're saying gallons, we're
It
not,
just depends what
Yeah.
you put in there. I mean, if it's all paperweight.
If you look on EPA's website, it's somewhere in the 1 to 3 pounds
Okay.
per gallon is the estimation of trash, which includes a little bit of saturated moisture and stuff that's in there, you know, because it's not 1
yeah.
pound per gallon, it's not 8, which is pure water.
Yeah.
It's like 2 to 3.
See, this is why I'm a local elected official and not a scientist. So thank
Mr.
you.
Osborne, I would encourage you not to put 100 gallons or 95 gallons of water in that tank simply because we have enough water in the landfill, we don't need any more.
Do you think the wheel would pop off?
The
if I did
wheels would
that?
pop off
Yeah.
of it and the sides would bust.
So
Okay.
we are agreeing to a couple more work sessions before next week, right? Or you can send something
I
out to
haven't-
us or email. I'm okay with it. Next Saturday and one more in the week. What do y'all think?
I would
Well-
prefer Saturday during the week.
You prefer Saturday?
As much as I
I've-
hate to say that, yes.
Okay.
I've got a job I have to do Saturday, and I hope that this doesn't go this long, because this has been a long work session. But we gotta get our heads wrapped around this, so we need to meet again.
But just tell me a date and time.
Well, I'd say is next Saturday from say 8:30 to 10:30 okay? At least another couple hours?
That's fine.
Yep.
And what do you want presented at that workshop?
Well, one thing I was wanting is kind of what we talked about. What's the fair rate that we could see if you just look at them independent and we don't take all these other anomalies into play, like commercial haulers and so forth? And where would we be with the index of inflation and fair rate for businesses and residents, which was what they would have to pay if we started over clean tomorrow, right, with a brand new landfill? What would that number be to cover our costs, our salaries, our, all of our environmental costs and everything? And it's probably pretty close to what you already said, it may, I don't know what it exactly is, but that's kind of one number, right? Where is that number? So the fee schedule, on residents is obviously, in gallons here, so we kind of have to put everything in the same unit of measure for businesses and residents, so we know where we are. That's one thing I would want to see where we think we need to be.
On the bright side, if there is a bright side, and I've thought this before for a long time before I set up here, is we've talked about the can. We talk a lot about how much the can is, but I feel like the city provides a lot of services for what we pay for now. And we talked a little bit about that earlier as far as your can, and we pick up leaves and grass clippings, and then we also do the bulk pickup. So if you put out your couch or a big TV or something, we'll pick that up too. So, and I've seen a lot of folks who live way out in the county that don't have even an option to get some of those services. So I think that's good, having a high level of service. It's a benefit of living in the city. And I think, Bob, we talked about how our city provides one of the highest level of services compared to some other places, wouldn't you say?
Yeah, that's correct.
Well, so the only thing I've got right now is go back to the beginning and figure out what the residential rate should have been in the beginning, and then determine what it would be now based on a CPI index increase.
And at least we know where the fair rate is. That's what we should expect to pay anyway. What else y'all want to see?
Yeah.
Bill, you don't want to see anything else?
No, not right now. I mean, like I say, to me, I'd like to see the whole rate study, but I know you're not going to do that in a week. That's going to take months, and that's a longer term part of this, because I think it gets back to your point, Anthony, is we're providing a lot of services, and what is the actual, how does that break down? What does it cost have them pick up my grass, pick up my leaves, pick up my trash, the bulk. And I think maybe we could find ways to not only know what that cost is, but then people make it much more a fee for service, so that, you know, if you don't want to, you want to mulch your grass and not set the clippings at the road, then you could save a little bit of money. And so, you know, I mean, you know, that, because that gets into fairness too. I mean, you're paying for a service you're not using. You want to make it fair for the people that are using the services, that they are paying their fair share. So that's another element of that fairness, but we won't know that until you do one of those kind of studies and see how it breaks down. And I seriously doubt that's something that you could get to in this budget cycle. That's a longer term issue.
Okay, so the only thing I'm going to provide to you all, and I'll try to get it to you this week even before the meeting, is what would our rate be if we charge, based on what it was in 1998 when we opened the landfill and had a consumer price index, and to back out everything associated with it other than just the traditional upkeep of the landfill and the collections piece.
So basically, we're, you know, this sheet here has got collection fees of everything we set. So we're talking about what we know, making that fair. You know, and I think.
Do you want it on commercial too, or just
Well, you got
residential?
single families right here, right? That's
Okay.
us living on whatever street. Then you got the commercial, which is the businesses, right? And that's why I said you got to look at that, because that's $80 per 95 gallons,
Right.
you know, converting that to weight and making that fair. And then I think even the charitable institutions, you know, they have a reduction, right, to 80%. Is that fair? Should they be changed in their rate structure? Right, so just try to make the people live inside the city, make it fair. What's a fair number for everybody that we go pick up trash? Just kind of start there. That's
Okay.
All right, and the gate rate tipping, gate rate going through is going from 30 to 36.
Right.
And that's for everybody that crosses the scales, regardless if they're contract or not.
No,
Okay.
no. If you go across a
Okay.
scale, you clean out a house, instead of paying $30 a ton, you're going to be paying 36 now.
Okay, all right.
If you are Smith County, you're paying whatever your contracted rate is.
Okay, I want to see some scenarios where good faith, and you need to work with these gentlemen over here, because they know who they deal with, the contracts that they have. Where is the threshold that we know is going to just turn these haulers away and they're going somewhere else? There has got to be room to charge them more money. There's got to be.
I think where you start with that is the price elasticity model. You add that per ton price that they showed us to each one of our contracts, and then you multiply that additional amount per the ton that they actually bring in, and that's going to tell you how much additional revenue you have. And then you assume any penny over that, you are losing that revenue at that
I
point.
understand that, but you have already established that $66 a month per household, or per ratepayer a month. It is a true private landfill for the next 125 years. They're already paying $264. So that means there's an additional,
Paying $264?
yeah, $22 a month right now.
Oh, I see, okay.
Yeah, they're paying $264 a year right now. And, we gotta keep crunching this math, and everybody's comments changes the math. I mean, you ask a question and things change 30 minutes or an hour later. But we've got to get to the true numbers on that landfill, because your option 5, you presented it at $51 for rate, and actually it turned out to be 66.
The only reason it was 51 is because we were not including the cost for the debt. Was it the debt or the liner?
I understand that, but it all needs to be calculated in. It's the operational cost of the.
Well, I
of
get
the
two,
landfill.
I've gotten two different things. The mayor says go back and calculate it without all that extra stuff, just assume that we didn't have the debt associated with it, and then I want it calculated with the debt, so do we want both options?
I would like to know
Okay.
the final.
You do it both.
This
I mean-
is what it is,
Okay.
regardless.
Well,
Well,
don't
I
put the-
think-
I don't want the debt in there personally, because it muddies the water on all the errors of the past. If you didn't have that, what would it look like too? Because we could always easily add it back in, right? We could say.
Well, we know what
okay,
the debt's gonna cost us.
Right, we know what the debt is, so we can just look at it irregardless of debt, and we know what the debt is, and we can just slide it back over there because we know what it is, right? That's easy to do. But don't put it in there to start with, because then you're having to figure out how to back it out, right?
It's just
Sure.
a difference in how people crunch his math. I mean, you can add it or leave it out.
But we gotta pay it all, so. All right, anything else?
Are you gonna,
Yeah, I'm gonna let everybody talk. All right, I guess that's it for the city manager.
Okay.
All right, who out there in the audience wants to come up and talk about the landfill and give us some more input? Anybody?
We all realize the problem, we can't fix it the next 2 weeks, you gotta have a budget now. Once you get what's fair, what citizens should be paying for collection services and disposal, you get that number and let Randy run with that. And all these other problems, which are major, can't be solved in 2 weeks. That's what the committees will have to figure out over the next year, probably. And that's to get, what are we gonna do in the 2021 year to help solve this problem on a long-term basis? We've kinda, we're all over the board, to tell the truth. The numbers we started with are not what we're working with today. So, I mean, we gotta change the math. I mean, it's just too much going on. There's too much problems. The information that Mr. Wingard needs is needed, but it's not gonna do us any good to get that information in this year's budget. Because for the same reason Randy said, you gotta have a fixed number that you can count on in your budget, because if you blow a few big accounts, that blows your whole budget, which screws up everything. So stick with the contracts we got, whether we like them or not, but be prepared for the 21 or the 2021 year to maybe mid-year or the three-quarter year, start raising those contract rates, and the people who are gonna leave, you'll know it right away. That at least will prepare you for your 2021 budget work. You can't afford to try that now, because if they leave now after you've already approved the budget and you're into the year and they say, well, we found another place, we're leaving. So I think we leave the contracts alone for this year. We will need to go up some on the residential based on the results of what inflation would have given it. And I think I agree with the mayor that we can't punish the citizen any more than we have to by not, we figure out what it would have been without any debt. The liner should have been in there. So that's a fair figure to put in, and the closure is fair. Leave the debt out for now. You can have the number to the side, which we talked about. So I believe that's the solution for this year's budget. We'll see what the fair rate should be for the commercial and the citizens residential. That's step one. That's a minor piece of the total puzzle, but that keeps us from getting into trouble during the year if people start leaving. I mean, not residents, but lose some of these contracts. So I believe that's the first step. It's a small one, but I mean, it's something better than doing nothing. But we know what, by this time next year, we should have a pretty good idea of what the heck's going to happen with the rest of the needs. Okay.
Thanks. Yeah, come on up.
I'm sorry.
Come on up. You're lucky this time, we're not gonna turn the light on.
don't take advantage of that,
Hey,
Nancy.
don't take advantage of the fact I'm not gonna turn the light on you, because you keep going on and on, I may have you turn the light on, so.
You exceeded your 3 minutes the other night. You can't talk again for another 6 or 8 weeks.
I don't have lights up here.
You went over your 3 minutes. I agree with most everything Mr. Hubbard just said. I think he used wisdom in his remarks. I think he's correct in most of what he said. Let me add a little bit of something to that, just for the thought process that you all will have to go through. I think tying the cost of picking up the trash to inflation is going to cause some trouble. The reason, I've been through all this about 10 times, you understand. I think that one of the reasons that rate was kept so low all through the years, right or wrong, the reason behind it was that there are so many low-income homeowners in the city of Bristol, Virginia. We are a low-income community. We have a low-income home ownership. And if you make it too hard to live in Bristol, Virginia, people are going to keep leaving. We've already lost over 800 people, you know. And I hate to see people have to leave their homes because the rate for living there is going up so high. Now, the inflation rate fluctuates. And I know that in years gone by, there were times when the council decided, leave that rate alone. That's something people can't, it's a tax. That's what it is. It's a tax. And it's a tax that we cannot refuse. I may take my trash to the front once every 4 weeks. I'm paying for it anyway, whether I take it down there or not. But there are going to be a lot of people who are going to say, if you go up any on that, I'm through. So I would urge you, yes, I think Archie will use great wisdom in his remarks, and I hope I am too as a follow-up. But remember, this is a low-income community. And if you make it too hard for people to live here, they're going to leave. Now, we're having trouble trying to get people to move in right now and to get businesses to move in right now. And one of the ways you can make it a little more attractive is say, all right, we may have to pick this little bit of money here on that trash pickup. We may have to pick that up somewhere else. And I think he's exactly right. And I told this council this last July. Stay the course for 1 year. Stay the course. It's a matter of record. Look it up, listen to it. Because at the end of this year, which will be the end of June, you will have the answers to a lot of questions that you don't have the answers to right now. You'll know, you already do know some of them. You know what the state of Virginia can and will or will not do. You know what the federal government can, will, or will not do to help us. We know some people we thought were coming who didn't come. Some things we hoped would happen did not happen. But stay the course for 1 year. I think you'll get the answers in less than a year, but I know it will be a year or a little bit less. And then you will have an idea of what step we can take, if we can take one, and what direction we should go. And I believe that, I agree. I think Archie and I are right on this. We don't always agree. But I think we're both right on this, and I think we're both giving you good information. And Lord knows our hearts are in the right place. I've got more important things to do. This is basketball season, you know. I can't fool around with the dump. Thank you, Mayor.
Go Tennessee.
If I could lean over to get my shoe off, I'd hit you with it.
All right, anybody else want to talk, Michael?
Thank you very much for asking for public comment at this time. My name is Michael Pollard. I live at 101 Ashley Drive. The landfill is an enterprise fund, and as such, it should be handled as a business, which is what much of this discussion has been about. One aspect of handling things as a business is competition, and that's even while the current arrangement does not allow private competition for the residential rates, I think it would be wise to compare those rates anyway to see what other areas charge, and not subsidized rates, because I know that a lot of our neighbors where trash collection is handled by the municipality, those rates are subsidized. I think it would be informative to compare with what rates are for private trash collection, such as waste management in the county. I understand that their rates are a little bit inconsistent, so it may take some research to figure out what the actual typical rates are. I looked up based on the address of my employer, and the rate there was $25 a month. I also think that it would not be fair to our residents to compare with a rate based on a lot of other services that the city does offer, such as grass and brush collection and large trash collection, if the majority of the residents do not use those services. It'd also be informative to know roughly what percentages of residents use and do not use those additional services, and how many of them are only using the containerized collection. Personally, I mulch my grass. I very rarely put anything by the curb for other collection, and I only actually have my container taken around about once a month or sometimes every other month. So as it is, I'm not getting full benefit from what I'm paying, but I have no choices in the matter. So I think having some competitive rates would be informative in helping make our decision whether or not that's used as a sole source of making a decision. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. Anybody else? All right, no one else? We're adjourned.